Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby as I pushed my cart down aisle 7, the wheels squeaking against the polished floor in an irregular rhythm that had started to get under my skin. Electromax stayed open 24 hours, but after midnight, the place transformed into something else entirely. The bright, welcoming retail space became a cathedral of shadows, where every display screen cast its own pale altar of light into the darkness. My shift supervisor had handed me the diagnostic order at 1:03 a.m. with the kind of casual indifference that comes from years of night work. "Run the full test cycle on the TV wall," he'd said, not bothering to look up from his clipboard. "Corporate wants everything checked before the morning rush." Standard procedure, really. Nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. The television display wall stretched 30 feet across the back of the electronics department. 42 screens arranged in 3 precise rows. During the day, they showcased everything from cooking shows to action movies, a cacophony of competing audio tracks that somehow merged into white noise. But now, in the dead hours of night, they waited in perfect silence. I connected my diagnostic tablet to the main hub, scrolling through the automated test sequences until I found the standard white screen protocol. 30 seconds of pure white light to check for dead pixels, color accuracy, and general functionality. Simple enough. I initiated the sequence and stepped back to observe. The screens flickered once, then bloomed into brilliant white rectangles that transformed the darkened store into something resembling an operating theater. The intensity was almost painful after the dim, ambient lighting, forcing me to squint as I began my visual inspection of the top row. Samsung, Sony, LG, all the major brands represented in their gleaming uniformity. That's when I saw it. A shadow, dark and quick, seemed to slide across the leftmost screen. Not a reflection. I was standing too far to the right for that. But something that moved with purpose, like a figure walking behind frosted glass. I blinked hard, assuming my eyes were adjusting poorly to the sudden brightness. But the white screens showed nothing now except their perfect, sterile glow. The 30-second cycle completed, and the screens went dark for the mandatory 3-second reset before beginning again. In that brief darkness, I could have sworn I heard something, a sound like fabric brushing against glass, so faint it might have been the building's ventilation system. The second cycle began. This time, I was ready. I focused on the leftmost screen, watching intently as the white light filled the display. For the first few seconds, nothing. Then, starting from the left edge, a darkness began to seep across the screen. Not a malfunction. This was deliberate, purposeful movement. The shadow had definition now, the suggestion of a human silhouette moving from left to right across the display. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my tablet, checking the security camera feeds. The store's surveillance system showed me the same view I was experiencing, a lone employee standing before a wall of white screens. No shadows, no movement. Nothing but the normal diagnostic sequence playing out exactly as programmed. But I was watching it happen. Right there, screen by screen, the figure was progressing across the display wall. It reached the third monitor, then the fourth, each transition smooth and fluid, as if the screens were windows into a single, continuous space, rather than individual units. The figure was walking toward me. I realized this with a cold certainty that made my stomach drop. Whatever I was seeing wasn't moving randomly across the displays. It had direction, intent. With each screen it traversed, it seemed to grow slightly larger, more defined. What had started as a vague shadow now had the clear outline of a person, though the details remained frustratingly unclear against the white background. The cycle ended. 3 seconds of darkness. I found myself holding my breath. When the third cycle began, the figure appeared immediately on the first screen, but this time it was walking faster. The 30-second cycle would complete in less time now, somehow compressed to perhaps 25 seconds. And the shadow was darker, more substantial. I could make out what might have been clothing, a dark coat or jacket that moved with the figure's stride. Above me, one of the ceiling lights flickered and went out. I looked up, then back at the screens. The figure had progressed to the 6th monitor now, definitely larger than before. If this continued, if it kept moving at this pace and growing with each cycle, it would reach the rightmost screen, the one closest to where I stood, in just a few more iterations. My radio crackled to life, startling me so violently that I nearly dropped my tablet. "Stock check needed in automotive," came the distant voice of my supervisor. "Anyone available?" I grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "This is Marcus in electronics. I'm running the diagnostic sequence right now. Can't leave the department." "Copy that. How much longer?" I looked at my tablet. The standard sequence called for 10 cycles total. We were only on the 3rd. 7 more cycles to go. "Roger. Continue with your assignment." The radio fell silent, and I was alone again with the wall of screens. The 3rd cycle was ending, darkness claiming the displays once more. Another ceiling light died, this one directly above the television wall. The shadows deepened. Cycle 4 began with the figure appearing on screen 2, having somehow gained distance while the displays were dark. It was moving with more urgency now, and I could see details that shouldn't have been possible on a diagnostic white screen. The suggestion of hair, dark and unkempt. Arms that swung naturally with its stride. Most unsettling of all, as it moved from screen to screen, it seemed to be looking directly at me. The cycle compressed again, running in perhaps 20 seconds instead of 30. The figure reached the 8th screen before the sequence ended, growing larger with each transition. It now took up nearly a quarter of each display, far too large to be a simple shadow or reflection. In the 3-second darkness between cycles, I heard it again, that fabric against glass sound, but louder now, more immediate, as if something was pressing against the screens from the inside. I needed to break the sequence. The realization hit me with sudden clarity. This wasn't going to stop on its own. Whatever was happening, it was building towards something, and I had the distinct feeling that I didn't want to find out what would happen when the figure reached the final screen. But the control hub was at the far end of the television wall, past all the displays. To reach it, I would have to walk directly in front of the screens, directly in the path of whatever was moving across them. Cycle 5 began. The figure now appeared on screen 4 immediately, and it was no longer just a shadow. I could see features, indistinct but unmistakably human. A face turned in my direction, watching me as it moved from display to display with increasing speed. The cycle was compressed to maybe 15 seconds now, and each screen showed the figure slightly closer to the glass, as if it was not just moving across the displays, but approaching the surface from some impossible depth. 3 more ceiling lights failed in rapid succession, following the figure's progress across the wall. The emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in a sickly red glow that made the white screens appear pink and somehow infected. I had to move. Now. I sprinted toward the control hub, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As I ran past the screens, I could see the figure keeping pace with me, matching my speed as it moved from display to display. It was looking directly at me now, and though I couldn't make out specific features, I had the horrible impression that it was smiling. The cycle ended just as I reached the hub. In the darkness, I fumbled with my tablet, trying to access the test sequence controls. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely navigate the menu system. Behind me, I could hear that brushing sound again, now accompanied by what might have been breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from all around me. Cycle 6 began. I didn't turn around, but I could see the reflected glow of the screens on the tablet's surface. The figure was there immediately, larger than ever, taking up nearly half of each display. The cycle was compressed to perhaps 10 seconds now, each repetition bringing it closer to the final screen where I stood. My fingers found the abort sequence command. I hesitated for just a moment. Corporate policy was clear about interrupted diagnostics requiring a full restart and incident report. But as I heard footsteps that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, policy became irrelevant. I terminated the sequence. The screens went dark instantly, plunging the department into the red twilight of emergency lighting. The silence that followed was absolute. No humming, no breathing, no footsteps. Just the distant sound of my own racing heartbeat. I stood there for several minutes, afraid to move, afraid to turn around. When I finally did, the television wall looked exactly as it should, 42 dark screens reflecting nothing but my own pale face in the emergency lighting. But something was different, wrong. My reflection in the screens wasn't quite right. The angle was off, as if I was looking at myself from slightly behind and to the left, and in that reflection, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, I could see another figure standing beside me. I spun around. The aisle was empty. When I looked back at the screens, my reflection was normal again. Alone. I filed the incident report as a standard diagnostic malfunction, screens displaying erratic shadows due to faulty backlighting. The technician who came out the next day found nothing wrong with any of the units. The diagnostic sequence ran perfectly, displaying 30 seconds of pure white light exactly as programmed. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm working late shifts and the store grows quiet, I catch myself avoiding the television department altogether. Because in the darkened screens, in those black mirrors that line the wall, I sometimes see things that shouldn't be there. Reflections that move independently of their sources. Shadows that watch. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see that figure again. Not walking across the screens now, but standing behind them, waiting patiently for the next diagnostic sequence to begin. The next time someone needs to run the white screen test. The next time someone stands alone in the red darkness, trying to convince themselves that what they're seeing isn't real. But the thing about reflections is that they only show you what's really there. And if something appears in a screen that should only display your own image, then maybe the question isn't whether it's real or not. Maybe the question is where it's been hiding all along. I still work the night shift at Electromax. I still run diagnostics when required. But I never run them alone anymore, and I've developed the habit of keeping my back to the wall, where nothing can approach from behind. Because sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the fluorescent lights hum their mechanical lullaby, and the emergency lighting casts everything in shades of red, I can hear that fabric against glass sound echoing through the empty store, and I know it's still looking for a way out. Story 2. And the stairs descended into earth that smelled of old copper pennies and forgotten promises. Each step echoed with a hollow ring, as if the concrete beneath my feet was merely a shell concealing something vast and empty. The hiring manager had warned me about the smell. Metallic, she'd said, like blood but sweeter. Though she'd failed to mention how it seemed to coat my tongue with each breath. 23 steps down. I'd counted them twice, though I couldn't say why precision mattered in a place that felt fundamentally imprecise, where shadows bent wrong and the walls seemed to breathe with condensation that appeared and vanished without pattern. The copper chalice hadn't seen customers since 1928, when Prohibition agents sealed it like a tomb. Now, nearly a century later, some entrepreneurial ghost had decided the world needed another speakeasy, another place where people could pretend the past was glamorous rather than desperate. They'd hired me to resurrect their cocktail program, to bring life back to recipes that had been buried with their creators. The bar stretched before me like an altar to excess, all burnished copper and tarnished brass. Every glass, every shaker, every stirring spoon gleamed with that particular patina that comes only from decades of careful use followed by decades of careful neglect. The mirror behind the bar was original, its silver backing spotted with dark blooms that looked disturbingly organic, like mold growing behind glass. I set my toolkit on the mahogany bar top and began my inspection. The equipment was immaculate despite its age. Someone had maintained it, though the owner swore the place had been untouched since the raids. Ice wells that should have been bone dry held a thin skin of water that never quite froze despite the basement's chill. Bottles lined the back bar, their labels faded but contents seemingly intact, though I knew better than to trust 100-year-old spirits. The first hour passed in mundane inventory. I cataloged what was salvageable, What needed replacement? What probably belonged in a museum rather than a working bar? The normalcy was almost disappointing. I'd expected more drama from a place with such carefully cultivated mystery. Then I heard the first clink. It came from the upper shelf, where copper mugs sat in neat rows like silent sentinels. A brief, crystalline note that hung in the air longer than physics should have allowed. I looked up, but nothing had moved. The mugs sat exactly as I'd left them, their handles all turned at identical angles. Another clink, this time from behind me. I spun around to find the lowball glasses on the speed rail swaying slightly, their rims kissing each other with tiny musical contacts. The air in the basement was perfectly still. No ventilation, no breeze, nothing that should have disturbed them. I told myself it was settling. Old buildings moved, materials expanded and contracted. Perfectly reasonable explanations for perfectly reasonable phenomena. But as I reached for one of the glasses to steady it, another clink echoed from the opposite end of the bar, then another from the copper mugs above. The sounds began to form a rhythm. Not random settling, but something deliberate, purposeful. Clink, clink, pause. Clink, clink, pause. Like a toast repeated endlessly, glasses meeting in celebration of something I couldn't see. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up a copper mug to examine it more closely. The moment my fingers wrapped around its handle, the clinking stopped. Complete silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. The mug was ice cold, so cold it burned, but I couldn't make myself let go. That's when I felt them. Fingers. Not my own. Wrapping around my hand from the outside, their touch so cold it went beyond sensation into something deeper, more fundamental. They guided my hand, tilting the empty mug toward an empty space in the air, holding it there in the universal gesture of a toast. I should have dropped the mug, should have run, should have done anything except stand there, paralyzed, while invisible hands manipulated my own. But the cold was spreading up my arm now, and with it came something else, a sense of profound loneliness, of waiting that had stretched across decades. These weren't malevolent touches. They were desperate. The contact lasted maybe 5 seconds before the fingers released me. I staggered backward, the mug clattering to the floor. The sound it made was wrong, too hollow, too resonant, as if it had fallen through more space than the few feet between my hand and the ground. I forced myself to retrieve it, noting that the copper showed no dents or scratches despite the fall. As I placed it back on the shelf, I noticed the photographs for the first time. They lined the wall behind the bar, black and white images in tarnished silver frames. Groups of people in 1920s attire, raising glasses in eternal celebration. But every single person faced away from the camera. Backs turned, heads angled away, as if they were all looking at something behind the photographer, something the camera couldn't capture. In every photograph, they held the same copper mugs I'd just been handling. The hiring manager had left me a folder of historical documents, and I spent the next hour poring over them with growing unease. The copper chalice had been famous for exactly one drink, the Bronze Ghost. The recipe was supposedly created by the original owner, a man named Samuel Hendricks, who'd claimed it could bridge the gap between the living and the lost. The ingredient list read like a catalog of the impossible. Wormwood from Bohemian absinthes that had been banned since 1915. Copper dust infused in grain alcohol. Tincture of mercury. Herbs that were either extinct or had never existed in the first place. At the bottom of the page, in Hendrick's spidery handwriting, was a single instruction that made my skin crawl. Serve to reflection, never to flesh. I researched Hendricks until my eyes burned from staring at the laptop screen. He'd vanished the night before the raids, leaving behind only empty bottles and a basement full of customers who, according to police reports, seemed confused about their own identities and unable to recall their faces when asked to describe themselves. The clinking started again as I read, softer now but more insistent. I looked up to find every glass in the place swaying gently, creating a symphony of barely audible chimes. In the spotted mirror behind the bar, I could see my own reflection watching me with an expression I didn't remember making. Over the following days, I became obsessed with recreating the Bronze Ghost. I haunted antiquarian bookshops and occult suppliers, tracking down ingredients that shouldn't have existed. The wormwood I found in a dusty apothecary run by an old woman who insisted I sign a waiver before she'd sell it to me. The copper dust came from a metal worker who ground it fresh from pre-1920 pennies, claiming newer alloys wouldn't work for old recipes. Each ingredient I acquired felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The mercury tincture required connections I'd rather not have made. The extinct herbs cost more than my monthly rent and came with warnings I chose not to heed. The bar welcomed me back each evening like an old friend. The clinking had become constant now, a barely perceptible soundtrack that followed me through my work. I'd grown accustomed to the cold touches, the way invisible hands would guide mine when I hesitated over a measurement or technique. They were teaching me, I realized, preparing me. The photographs had multiplied, or perhaps I was simply noticing more of them. They covered the walls now, dozens of images of faceless figures raising copper vessels in eternal celebration. Some were clearly from the 1920s, but others looked newer, their clothing suggesting different decades. In a few, I could swear I glimpsed modern hairstyles, contemporary eyewear. My own reflection had become unreliable. Sometimes it lagged behind my movements by a fraction of a second. Other times it seemed to move independently, tilting its head when mine was still, smiling when I frowned. I'd catch it watching me in peripheral vision, but it always snapped back to mimicry when I looked directly. The night I finally completed the bronze ghost, the basement fell completely silent for the first time since I'd started working there. No clinking, no subtle sounds of settling. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. The cocktail was beautiful in its wrongness. The liquid moved like mercury but gleamed like polished copper. It gave off no aroma I could identify, yet it made my mouth water and my stomach turn simultaneously. In the copper mug it seemed to glow with its own light, casting shifting shadows that didn't correspond to any light source in the room. I carried it to the mirror as Hendrik's instructions demanded. The reflection of the drink looked different somehow, darker, more viscous, as if the mirror showed not what was, but what would be. My reflected self reached for the mug with eager hands, though I maintained careful distance from the glass. As I raised the vessel toward the mirror, preparing to serve the bronze ghost to my reflection, I felt the familiar cold touch on my hand. But this time, the fingers didn't guide me. They resisted. Invisible hands wrapped around my wrist, trying to pull the mug away from the mirror, toward my own lips. The photographs on the walls began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the faceless figures started to turn. Still no features visible, but their postures changing, their attention focusing on me. In the mirror, my reflection smiled with teeth I'd never seen before, its free hand pressed against the glass from the inside. I understood then that Hendrix's instructions had been deliberately ambiguous. Serve to reflection, never to flesh. But which was which? Was I flesh looking at reflection, or reflection looking at flesh? Were the cold fingers trying to save me from drinking, or save themselves from my refusing? The bronze ghost trembled in my hand, its surface rippling with patterns that suggested faces just beneath the surface. In the mirror, my reflection mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Welcome home. The photographs showed me now, my back turned to unseen cameras, raising a copper mug in eternal toast. In some, I stood behind this very bar. In others, I seemed to be seated among the faceless customers. All of them recent, all of them waiting. I could choose. Drink the bronze ghost and join the cold fingers that had guided me, become part of the endless toast that echoed through the basement. Or serve it to the mirror, let my reflection drink, and risk discovering which of us was real. The mug grew heavier in my hand, its copper surface warming under my touch. Around me, the silence stretched like held breath, and I realized that whatever choice I made, I'd been making it since the moment I'd first heard the clinking glasses. In the mirror, my reflection waited with infinite patience, its copper mug raised in eternal salute to possibilities I was only beginning to understand. The bronze ghost caught the light like liquid metal, beautiful and terrible and final. And in that moment, surrounded by photographs of faceless celebrants and guided by invisible hands, I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The question was no longer whether to drink. The question was whether I already had. Story 3. The lampposts stretched ahead like sentinels in the pre-dawn darkness, their amber glow casting long shadows across the asphalt path that bisected Riverside Park. I pulled my scrubs tighter against the October chill, the fabric still carrying the antiseptic smell of the hospital ward where I'd spent the last 16 hours. Double shifts had become routine since the nursing shortage hit our unit, but the overtime pay helped cover rent in this expensive city. My sneakers squeaked against the damp pavement with each step, a rhythmic soundtrack to my journey home. The park served as a shortcut between the hospital and the bus stop on Elm Street, a 10-minute walk that saved me from a 30-minute detour around the perimeter. At 3 in the morning, the park belonged to joggers, shift workers like myself, and the occasional homeless person seeking shelter under the gazebo near the pond. Tonight felt different, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the unusual stillness in the air, or the way fog seemed to cling to the ground despite the absence of rain. Even the familiar sounds of the city, distant traffic, late-night sirens, the hum of air conditioning units, seemed muffled, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton. I'd covered maybe a third of the distance when the wind picked up, carrying with it the earthy scent of autumn leaves and something else I couldn't identify. Something almost medicinal, like the cleaning solutions we used in the ICU. The breeze whispered through the bare branches overhead, creating a soft susurrus that might have been soothing under different circumstances. Then I heard it. "You should be home, gentleman." The words came so softly they might have been my imagination, carried on that same breeze that rustled the leaves. I stopped walking and turned around, scanning the path behind me for any sign of another person. The lampposts illuminated empty concrete stretching back toward the hospital, their pools of light creating islands of visibility in an ocean of shadows. "Hello?" My voice sounded smaller than I'd intended, swallowed by the park's oppressive quiet. No response came, just the continued whisper of wind through branches. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, probably just fatigue playing tricks on my mind. 16-hour shifts could do that to a person, make them hear things that weren't there, see movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look directly. I resumed walking, but my pace had quickened slightly. The sooner I reached the bus stop, the sooner I could get home to my apartment, to the familiar comfort of my own bed and the promise of 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep. That's when the first light went out. The lamppost directly behind me flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging that section of path into darkness. I felt my pulse spike as I turned to stare at the now dark pole. Equipment malfunction, I told myself. Old infrastructure, probably overdue for maintenance. The city was always behind on upkeep in the parks. But then the next light died, and the next, each lamp extinguished in perfect sequence, as if someone were following behind me with a switch, systematically removing each source of illumination from my route. The darkness crept forward like a living thing, swallowing the path I'd just traversed and leaving me in an ever-shrinking corridor of light. My walk became a hurried stride, then nearly a jog. Behind me, I could hear the electrical hum of each lamp fading to silence, one after another, maintaining perfect pace with my movement. No matter how fast I walked, the darkness stayed exactly the same distance behind, close enough that I could feel its presence, but not so close that it overtook me. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in medical science and evidence-based thinking, insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Power grid failure, maybe, or some kind of cascading electrical problem. But that rational voice grew quieter with each step as something primitive and instinctual took over, flooding my system with adrenaline and the urgent need to escape. I was perhaps halfway through the park when I noticed the footprints. They appeared in the amber circle of light cast by the lamp ahead of me, wet impressions on the dry concrete that matched the tread pattern of my own sneakers exactly. But these prints were pointing in my direction, as if someone wearing identical shoes had walked this path before me. leaving behind evidence of their passage in moisture that had no obvious source. The sight of them made me stumble to a halt. I looked down at my own feet, then back at the mysterious prints ahead. Same size, same pattern, even the same worn spot on the left heel where I'd developed a tendency to drag that foot slightly when tired. As I stood there staring, another lamp went dark behind me. The sound reached my ears a half-second later. Not the quick pop of a blown bulb, but a gradual electrical whine as the light dimmed and died. The darkness had gained ground during my pause, and I could feel it pressing against my back like a physical presence. I forced myself forward, stepping carefully around the wet footprints. As soon as my foot touched the concrete beyond them, the lamp ahead, the one that had illuminated the mysterious impressions, went dark with that same electrical whine. In the new pool of light cast by the next lamp, more footprints waited. The pattern repeated itself with mechanical precision. Each light ahead revealed a new set of wet prints, identical to my own, but somehow wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. When I stepped past them, that light would die, and the next lamp would reveal yet another set of impressions leading me forward. By the time I reached the midpoint of the park, where a small gazebo sat beside a duck pond, my hands were shaking. The wet footprints had become more pronounced, as if whoever or whatever was creating them was pressing harder into the concrete with each step. The moisture seemed to glisten in the lamplight, catching and reflecting the amber glow like tiny mirrors embedded in the pavement. I tried to convince myself this was all some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe maintenance workers were having some fun with the overnight shift workers who used this path. Maybe there was a simple explanation for the prints, condensation from underground pipes, or some kind of chemical reaction I didn't understand. But then I made the mistake of stepping on one. The moment my foot made contact with the wet impression, I felt it. Fingers, ice cold and impossibly strong, wrapping around my ankle beneath the concrete. Not grabbing at my foot from the surface, but reaching up from below, as if hands were buried in the earth and pushing through solid pavement to claim me. I jerked my leg up with a strangled gasp, nearly losing my balance in the process. The sensation vanished immediately, but phantom cold lingered around my ankle like a memory of frostbite. I stood there panting, staring down at the innocent-looking footprint that had felt so sinister just moments before. Behind me, another lamp died. The darkness was getting closer now, and I could swear I felt something watching me from within it. Not malevolent exactly, but patient, waiting. The voice came again, soft as falling leaves. Gentle man should rest. Gentle man works too hard. This time I was certain I'd heard it, though the source remained invisible. The voice carried a quality that seemed both concerned and predatory, like a parent coaxing a child to bed while harboring secret intentions. "What do you want?" I whispered to the darkness, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The response came not in words, but in action. The wet footprints ahead began to multiply, no longer appearing one at a time, but in clusters. Sets of 3, then 5, then 10, all leading forward toward the park's exit. They covered the entire width of the path now, making it impossible to walk without stepping on at least one. I understood the trap immediately. Whatever force was creating these impressions had grown tired of the game. It wanted me to touch them, to feel those cold fingers wrap around my ankles and pull me down into whatever lay beneath the solid concrete. The voice had called me gentle. Perhaps whatever hunted in this park preferred its prey compliant, exhausted from double shifts and too tired to run. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I climbed onto one of the park benches that lined the path, using it to bypass the first cluster of prints. The metal was cold against my palms, and I could feel vibrations running through it, as if something large were moving underground. From my elevated position, I could see that the wet impressions extended beyond just the main path. They covered the grass, the side trails, even climbed partway up the trunks of nearby trees. The message was clear. There was no way around them, only through. I leaped from bench to bench, then to a trash can, then to the low wall that bordered the duck pond. The water reflected the lamplight in ripples, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving beneath the surface. a pale shape that might have been a face looking up at me. But when I focused on it directly, there was nothing but dark water and the reflection of amber light. My makeshift obstacle course carried me perhaps 50 yards before I ran out of elevated surfaces. The path ahead stretched empty except for the carpet of wet footprints and the dwindling line of lampposts. Behind me, the darkness had gained ground during my aerial detour, close enough now that I could feel its chill against my back. I was 3/4 of the way through the park when exhaustion finally caught up with me. 16 hours on my feet, followed by this nightmare obstacle course, had drained whatever reserves I'd had left. My legs shook as I balanced on the last park bench before a long stretch of uninterrupted path, and I knew I wouldn't be able to maintain this elevated route much longer. The wet footprints below seemed to sense my weakness. They began to pulse with a faint luminescence like bioluminescent algae responding to disturbance. The glow was barely visible, just enough to make them stand out against the concrete like a constellation of traps waiting to snare the unwary. "Rest now, gentle man. You've worked so hard." The voice was closer this time, almost intimate, as if someone were standing just behind my shoulder. I spun around but saw only the advancing wall of darkness where lampposts had been snuffed out in sequence. Yet I could feel breath against my neck, cold and smelling of antiseptic and something else, something earthy and final. That's when I noticed my reflection in the bench's metal armrest. The polished surface showed my face exhausted and pale, but it also showed something else. In the reflection, I could see myself from earlier in the night, walking this same path in the opposite direction. Not a memory, but somehow happening simultaneously. Another version of me heading toward the hospital for the start of my shift, while this version tried desperately to get home. As I watched, reflection me stopped and turned around, scanning the path behind him. He was hearing the voice for the first time, just as I had. In the metal surface, I saw him continue walking, saw the lights begin to go out behind him, saw him discover the first set of wet footprints. But there was more. In the reflection, I could see what followed reflection me through the darkness. Not a monster or ghost, but myself again. A third version, pale and translucent, matching his steps exactly and creating the wet impressions with feet that seemed to barely touch the ground. This other me moved with purpose, herding reflection me forward, just as something was herding the real me. The loop was complete. I was both hunter and hunted, predator and prey, trapped in an endless cycle of walking this path while simultaneously pursuing myself. The gentle voice belonged to me, to some version of me that had been walking this route for who knew how long, trying to guide other iterations home. "You should rest now," I heard myself whisper from the darkness behind me. "You work too hard, gentle man." I looked down at the wet footprints covering the path ahead and realized they weren't traps at all. They were offers, invitations to step out of the endless cycle and join the other versions of myself in whatever peaceful darkness waited beneath the concrete. No more double shifts, no more exhaustion, no more walking alone through empty parks at 3 in the morning. Part of me wanted to accept. The larger part knew I had to keep moving. I jumped down from the bench and began to run, leaping over clusters of glowing footprints like a child playing hopscotch. Behind me, I could hear my own voice calling out with increasing urgency, no longer gentle but desperate. The darkness surged forward, and I felt cold fingers brush against my heels as I ran. The park exit appeared ahead, marked by a street lamp that belonged to the city grid rather than the park system. Real light, harsh and electric and beautifully ordinary. I sprinted toward it as the last lamp in the park died behind me, plunging the entire path into absolute darkness. I burst through the park boundary and onto Elm Street, gasping and shaking. The bus stop sat 20 yards away, bathed in the mundane glow of urban lighting. Traffic moved past in the distance, real cars with real people going about their early morning routines. I turned back to look at the park entrance and saw nothing unusual. The lampposts stood in their neat rows, all functioning normally, casting amber light on empty paths. No wet footprints, no advancing darkness, no whispered voices carried on the wind. Just an ordinary urban park where a tired nurse had let his imagination run wild during an early morning walk. But as I waited for the bus, I found myself staring at my reflection in the shelter's glass wall. In the surface, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, I could see another version of myself still walking through the park. And behind him, following at a careful distance, walked another. The bus arrived 7 minutes later. I got on, paid my fare, and rode home to my apartment without looking back. But I knew I'd be working another double shift soon, and when I did, I'd have to walk through the park again. After all, it was the fastest route home, and every gentleman deserves his rest. Story 4. The forum post had seemed innocent enough at 3 in the morning, fingers trembling over the keyboard as I typed. Looking for travel companion. 25 mem. I'm planning to walk cross-country. Serious inquiries only. At that hour, with my lease expired and my last paycheck already spent on hiking boots, the idea felt like salvation rather than madness. I'd expected responses from fellow wanderers, maybe some concerned warnings about highway safety. What I hadn't expected was Observo 2000. The username appeared in my inbox within minutes, as if the user had been waiting. The message contained no pleasantries, no questions about my route or experience, just coordinates: 38.7543 degree N, 121.2856 degree W, and a single line: sunset tomorrow, come alone. When I tried to reply asking for a phone number or video call, the response came back immediately. No cameras, no voices. Trust requires distance. Something about that phrase made my skin crawl, but desperation overrode caution. I needed this. The coordinates led to a viewpoint 60 miles east, accessible only by a dirt road that snaked through dead chaparral. I arrived as the sun bled orange across the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward me like fingers. The overlook was exactly as desolate as I'd feared. Cracked concrete barriers, rusted railings, and a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I waited. The temperature dropped with the light, and by the time full darkness arrived, I was alone with nothing but the distant hum of highway traffic miles below. No Observo 2000, no fellow traveler, just me and the growing certainty that I'd driven here for nothing. That's when I heard the footsteps. They started behind me, slow and deliberate on the gravel. I turned, expecting to see a figure emerging from the shadows, but found only empty space. The sounds continued: crunch, step, crunch, maintaining their rhythm as if someone were still walking. I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls, but received no answer. The footsteps stopped when I stopped moving, resumed when I did. They stayed consistently behind me, just far enough back that when I spun around, I saw only darkness. By the third time I tried this, my hands were shaking. That's when I noticed the small digital recorder sitting on the concrete barrier. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I was certain of that. The device was old, the kind with actual buttons and a tiny LED display. As I approached it, the display flickered to life. Play? I pressed the button. The voice that emerged was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It possessed a quality that made me think of radio static shaped into words, familiar yet impossible to place. You wanted a companion for your journey. I am here. I have been watching your posts, your preparations. You seek something beyond the ordinary path, don't you? Something that will change you. The recording paused, and in that silence, I heard the footsteps again, circling me now like a predator testing boundaries. I can show you routes no map contains, destinations that exist only for those brave enough to abandon certainty. But you must follow my instructions precisely. First, never attempt to see me. When you hear my voice, do not turn toward it. When you sense my presence, do not seek its source. Trust in guidance without form. I should have left then. Should have thrown the recorder into the canyon and driven home. Instead, I found myself nodding to the empty air. Begin walking east at dawn. I will guide you. 7 days of perfect obedience, and I will show you the exit from the road where time renounces. The recording ended with a click that seemed to echo longer than physics allowed. I spent that night in my car, doors locked, watching the darkness beyond the windows. The footsteps continued their patient circuit around the vehicle, until the first pale edge of sunrise touched the horizon, then silence. At dawn, I shouldered my pack and began walking east. The voice started within an hour, drifting from somewhere behind my left shoulder. It offered directions in that same static touch tone. Turn north at the fallen pine. Follow the ridgeline. Avoid the trail markers. They lead to places you've already been. I obeyed, despite every instinct screaming warnings. The landscape I traversed felt subtly wrong, as if someone had taken familiar wilderness and shifted it slightly off-center. Trees grew at angles that hurt to look at. Shadows fell in directions that contradicted the sun's position. The air itself tasted different, metallic, charged with potential. By the second day, I'd begun to notice the monuments. They appeared in peripheral vision first, massive stone structures that vanished when I turned for a direct look. But in those split-second glimpses, I saw enough to make my blood freeze. The monuments bore faces, human faces carved with impossible detail, and they all looked like mine. Do not look directly at what you see, the voice warned when I hesitated during one sighting. Those places exist only when unobserved. Your attention gives them power, but curiosity proves stronger than caution. On the third day, when another monument appeared in my peripheral vision, I turned to face it fully. The world flickered. For perhaps a heartbeat, the pine forest around me vanished, replaced by a vast gray desert stretching to every horizon. The monument stood revealed, 100 feet of black stone carved into my own likeness, expression frozen in silent scream. Dozens of similar structures dotted the wasteland, all bearing my face in various states of anguish or terror. Then reality snapped back like a rubber band, leaving me gasping in familiar woodland. "You looked," the voice said, and for the first time, it carried emotion. Disappointment. The first rule broken. But perhaps forgiveness is possible. Continue walking. The fourth and fifth days blended together in a haze of increasing wrongness. I lost the ability to trust my own senses. Sounds came from impossible directions. My shadow moved independently, lagging behind or racing ahead. The taste of metal in the air grew stronger, accompanied by a constant low humming that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard construction sounds. The ring of chisels on stone, the scrape of tools carving features into rock. When I forced myself to look up at the night sky, I saw stars arranged in patterns that spelled out words in languages I couldn't read, but somehow understood. They spoke of patience, of watching, of hunger for form. The voice continued its guidance, but its instructions had become more complex, more disturbing. Walk backward for exactly 47 steps. Stop at the tree that remembers your childhood. Place your hand on the bark and feel it pulse. I obeyed, hating myself for it, because the alternative, acknowledging that I might be walking alone through wilderness, following commands from my own fracturing mind, seemed worse than supernatural manipulation. On the sixth day, I made a mistake that changed everything. The voice had been silent for hours when I spotted another monument through the trees. This one was different, smaller, more detailed. Instead of looking away, I found myself drawn forward, step by careful step, until I stood directly before it. The carved face was mine, but older, worn by years of exposure to elements that had never touched my actual skin. The stone lips were slightly parted, as if about to speak. Lichen grew in patterns that resembled tears. I reached out to touch the carving. My hand passed through empty air. When I looked again, I was touching the bark of an ordinary pine tree. No monument, no carved face. Just wood and sap, and the sudden, terrible understanding that I might have been alone all along. "Disappointing," said the voice, but it seemed to come from inside my own skull now rather than from behind my shoulder. "You're beginning to doubt. Doubt destroys the necessary faith." "What are you?" I asked the empty forest. "I am the part of you that needs to believe someone is watching. The part that would rather follow mysterious instructions than admit you made a catastrophic mistake." The words hit like physical blows. I spun in circles, searching for the source, but found only trees and shadows and the growing certainty that I'd been talking to myself for 6 days. Or perhaps I am exactly what I claim to be. The voice continued. Perhaps the monuments are real, and your doubt is the delusion. Perhaps time really does renounce its authority on the 7th day, and you'll finally understand what you've been walking toward. I pulled out the recorder, hands shaking. The display showed no indication that anything had been playing. No audio files, no playback history. Just an empty device with a dead battery. But the voice continued speaking. Tomorrow is the 7th day. Make your choice. Keep walking and trust in what you cannot see. Or stop here and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been revealed. That night, I built a fire and sat staring into the flames, trying to reconstruct the past week with any kind of rational framework. Had I imagined everything? The monuments, the voice, the impossible geography? Was I suffering some kind of breakdown, wandering alone through ordinary wilderness while my mind constructed elaborate fantasies? Or was something genuinely watching me, guiding me toward a destination that existed beyond normal reality? The fire burned low, and in the shifting shadows, I saw faces in the flames. My face, carved in light and ash, mouth moving in silent words. The shadows behind me stirred with suggestion of movement, of presence, of footsteps that left no prints. When dawn broke on the 7th day, I made my decision. I picked up the dead recorder, held it for a long moment, then hurled it as far into the trees as my strength allowed. The device struck a trunk with a plastic crack that echoed like breaking bones. Immediately the forest went silent. No bird calls, no rustle of wind through leaves. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. Then I saw it. The thing stood perhaps 20 feet away, watching me with eyes that reflected no light. It had been trying to approximate human form, but had gotten the proportions subtly wrong. Arms too long, torso too thin, head canted at an angle that suggested injury or impossible flexibility. Its face was a crude sketch of mine, features roughly placed as if carved by someone working from a half-remembered description. We stared at each other across that impossible distance. "Now you see me," it said, but its mouth didn't move. The words formed directly in my mind, carrying the taste of metal and the smell of old stone. "Now we can begin the real journey." It gestured toward a path I hadn't noticed before, a trail that led not through the forest, but into it, branches parting like curtains to reveal passage into spaces that violated geometry. Beyond the opening, I glimpsed the gray desert of my visions, populated by monuments that stretched to every horizon. "The exit from the road where time renounces," the thing explained. "You wanted to walk cross-country. I offer you the chance to walk across everything." I looked at the path, then back at the creature. Its approximation of my face wore an expression I couldn't read. Hunger, perhaps, or anticipation. Or maybe just the patient look of something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to make exactly this choice. Behind me lay the ordinary world, the possibility of hiking back to civilization, of finding help, of explaining this episode as exhaustion-induced hallucination. Ahead lay the promise of revelation, of answers to questions I hadn't known I was asking. The thing extended one impossibly long arm toward me, palm up in invitation. "Choose," it said. And I realized that whether this moment was supernatural encounter or complete psychological break, the choice itself was equally real. I could turn back toward sanity, or step forward into whatever lay beyond the boundary of ordinary experience. The gray path waited. The monuments of my face watched from their desert plain. Time itself seemed to pause, as if waiting for my decision to determine whether it would continue its normal flow or release its hold on causality entirely. I took a step toward the thing that wore my face, then another. And as my foot crossed the threshold into impossible geography, I felt time slip sideways, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I would never know whether I was walking into revelation or madness. Both possibilities led to the same destination. The path ahead stretched infinitely forward, populated by versions of myself I had never been but somehow recognized. And somewhere behind me, growing fainter with each step, I could hear the sound of a digital recorder playing an endless loop of static-shaped words, guiding another lost traveler toward their own moment of choice. The road where time renounces had claimed another pilgrim, or perhaps it had simply driven another wanderer completely insane. I no longer cared about the distinction. Story 5. The fluorescent lights in room 412 hummed their familiar death rattle as I made my rounds that Tuesday night. 3 months into this job at Willowbrook Geriatric Care, and I still hadn't grown accustomed to the sounds that old buildings make when darkness settles in. But tonight felt different. Thicker somehow, like the air itself had grown dense with something I couldn't name. Mrs. Patterson dozed peacefully in bed 1, her oxygen machine providing its steady mechanical breathing. Mr. Chen occupied bed 2, occasionally muttering Mandarin phrases in his sleep that sounded like prayers or warnings. Bed 3 held Mrs. Rodriguez, who always slept with one eye slightly open, creating the unsettling impression that she was watching even in slumber. And then there was bed 4. Empty. Always empty. The administration had placed it there 6 months ago, they told me, in anticipation of another resident. But no one ever came. The bed remained made with crisp white sheets, the pillow fluffed and positioned just so, as if waiting for someone who would never arrive, or perhaps someone who had never left. I checked the time on my phone. 11:47 p.m. The night stretched ahead like a long tunnel with no visible end. My supervisor, Janet, had called in sick again, the 3rd time this month, leaving me alone with the 32 residents spread across 4 floors. The skeleton crew consisted of just me and Sarah, the weekend nurse who worked the opposite wing and rarely ventured to this side of the building. As I moved through my routine checks, measuring blood pressure and adjusting IV drips, I noticed the subtle wrongness that had been growing stronger each night. The way shadows seemed to linger in corners even when light should have banished them. The whispers that could have been the heating system but sounded too much like conversations in a language I couldn't quite catch. The persistent feeling that someone was always just outside my peripheral vision, waiting. By midnight, I had settled into the nurses' station directly across from room 412. The monitors displayed vital signs for all residents, neat green lines tracing the rhythm of life across black screens. Everything appeared normal, but normal had become a relative concept in this place. I dimmed the hallway lights for the overnight hours, leaving only the emergency illumination and the glow from various machines. The building seemed to exhale, settling into its nocturnal routine. That's when I heard it, the sound of fabric stretching, like someone carefully lowering themselves onto a mattress, trying not to disturb anyone else. It came from room 412, specifically from the direction of bed 4. I looked up from my paperwork, scanning the monitor bank. Mrs. Patterson's heart rate, 78 BPM. Mr. Chen, 82 BPM. Mrs. Rodriguez, 71 BPM. And a 4th reading, 45 BPM. The number glowed steadily on a monitor that shouldn't have been reading anything at all. Bed 4 had no patient, no sensors, no reason to register vital signs. Yet there it was, a slow, deep rhythm that pulsed with mechanical certainty. I stood and walked to the doorway of room 412, peering into the dimness. The 3 occupied beds held their sleeping occupants, peaceful and undisturbed. Bed 4 remained empty, its white sheets undisturbed and perfectly smooth. But as I watched, something else became apparent. The steady sound of breathing. Not the shallow, irregular patterns of the elderly patients, but deep, slow inhalations that seemed to match that impossible 45 BPM reading. Reaching for the light switch, I flicked on the room's overhead fluorescence. The sudden brightness made me squint, and when my eyes adjusted, I checked the monitor again. The 4th reading had vanished. The breathing had stopped. Only the 3 legitimate residents remained, their monitors showing normal nighttime vitals. I told myself it was equipment malfunction, Old hospitals were notorious for electrical quirks and phantom readings. The building's aging infrastructure probably created interference, cross signals from other floors bleeding through the system. Perfectly logical explanations existed for everything I had witnessed, but logic felt thin as paper in the darkness of room 412. Over the following hours, the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Every time I dimmed the lights, the fourth monitor would flicker to life within minutes. Every time I investigated, turning on the room lights would make it disappear. The breathing sound became more distinct each time, accompanied by what sounded like someone shifting their weight on the mattress. Small movements, careful and deliberate. During one particularly detailed observation, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The pillow on bed 4, which had been perfectly fluffed and positioned, now showed a slight indentation, not dramatic enough to suggest someone had actually been lying there, but subtle, the kind of depression that might form if a head had rested against it for just a few minutes. I approached the bed cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the institutional carpeting. The mattress looked normal, but when I pressed my hand against it, the surface felt warm. Not hot, not obviously heated, but carrying the residual warmth of recent occupation. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe the heating system created ambient warmth. Maybe the mattress retained heat from the day's activities. But what activities? No one had been in this bed for months. As I leaned closer, examining the sheets for any other signs of disturbance, the lights went out. Not just the room lights. Every light on the floor had shut off simultaneously, plunging the entire wing into darkness, save for the dim emergency exit signs and the green glow of the monitors. The backup generators should have kicked in immediately, but they remained silent. Even my phone's flashlight seemed weaker than it should have been, its beam barely penetrating the thick darkness. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time. Snoring. Deep, resonant snoring coming from bed 4, the sound of someone in profound sleep. The kind of breathing that suggested complete relaxation, total unconsciousness. But there was something else, something that made every instinct scream danger. The snoring had an odd quality, like it was being produced by lungs that weren't quite the right size or shape for human breathing. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking despite my efforts to remain calm. When the fluorescence flickered back to life, silence returned instantly. The bed appeared empty once again, but now I could see another detail that hadn't been there before. The sheets were wrinkled, pulled slightly toward the foot of the bed as if someone had been stretching their legs in their sleep. The monitors showed 3 normal readings. No fourth pulse. No evidence of the presence I had clearly heard breathing just moments before. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance, checking the room every 30 minutes, documenting everything in a notebook I kept hidden from my supervisor. The patterns never varied. Lights off meant the return of the impossible presence. Lights on meant its disappearance. But each cycle brought new details, small changes that suggested the entity, if that's what it was becoming more substantial, more confident. During my research the following day, I discovered the old filing cabinet in the basement storage room. Most facilities had digitized their records years ago, but Willowbrook maintained paper backups dating back decades. The folder I found was thin, marked only with Room 412, historical, in faded ink. Inside were admission forms, treatment notes, and incident reports spanning 15 years. Most documented routine admissions and discharges, nothing unusual, but tucked between more recent files was a set of papers that had been deliberately misfiled, as if someone had tried to bury them without actually destroying them. The admission form was dated 3 years ago. Harrison Thorne, 73 years old, admitted with advanced dementia and aggressive behavioral episodes. The treatment notes painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly violent and unpredictable, requiring sedation and restraints. Staff members had requested transfers away from his case. Several incident reports described unexplained equipment failures in his room, along with complaints from other residents about nighttime disturbances. Then the record simply stopped. No discharge summary, no transfer documentation, no death certificate. The last entry, written in shaky handwriting, simply stated, "Patient Harrison Thorne removed from active roster. Administrative decision. No further documentation required." But someone had added a handwritten note in different ink, apparently added later. Never discharged, never died, never gone. I spent the following week trying to trace what had happened to Harrison Thorne. No other local facilities had records of receiving him. No funeral homes had any documentation. He had simply vanished from all official records, as if he had never existed. Yet the evidence suggested he had been real, had been violent, and had somehow been erased from the system without explanation. The nightly encounters in room 412 became more intense. The phantom breathing grew louder, sometimes accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversations with invisible companions. The indentations in the pillow and mattress became more pronounced. One night, I found the sheets completely disheveled, twisted as if someone had been tossing and turning for hours. But the most disturbing development was the gradual change in the other residents. Mrs. Patterson began experiencing nightmares, crying out in her sleep about someone watching her. Mr. Chen started refusing to enter his room during the day, insisting that someone else was already in bed 4. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been nonverbal since her stroke, began pointing at the empty bed and shaking her head violently whenever I tried to approach it. I attempted to have the bed removed, telling my supervisor that it was unnecessary and taking up space that could be used for medical equipment. But every effort failed in increasingly bizarre ways. The maintenance crew reported that the bed's wheels had somehow locked in place, impossible to move despite appearing normal. When they tried to disassemble it, the screws wouldn't turn, as if they had been welded in place. Most disturbing was their claim that the mattress had become impossibly heavy. What should have been a standard hospital mattress now required 4 men to lift, and even then it seemed to resist their efforts with an almost sentient stubbornness. The administration grew suspicious of my requests. Janet pulled me aside one morning, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes watchful. She mentioned that previous staff members had made similar complaints about room 412. They had all eventually been transferred to other facilities or had quit entirely. The implication was clear: continue down this path, and my employment would be terminated. But I couldn't let it go. Whatever presence occupied bed 4 was growing stronger, more active. The 45 BPM reading on the monitors had begun appearing even when the lights were on, though only briefly. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The impression of someone sitting up in bed just as I turned away. The breaking point came during my 7th week of night shifts. I had developed a routine of sleeping during the day and arriving early to research the building's history and previous incidents. That Tuesday night felt different from the moment I walked through the doors. The air seemed charged with anticipation, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. At 2:17 a.m., I was updating medication charts when every monitor in the nurses' station began displaying the same reading. 45 BPM. Not just the phantom 4th monitor. Every single screen showed that slow, deep pulse. Mrs. Patterson's monitor, Mr. Chen's monitor, Mrs. Rodriguez's monitor, even the backup machines that weren't connected to any patients. All of them pulsed in perfect synchronization, creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to echo through the building itself. I walked to room 412, my feet moving without conscious decision. The darkness seemed deeper than usual, pressing against me with almost physical weight. The 3 legitimate residents slept peacefully, but bed 4 was no longer empty. The sheets were pulled back, as if someone had just gotten up. The pillow bore a clear head-shaped indentation, but most unsettling was the way the mattress was still compressed in the center, maintaining the exact shape of a human body even though no one was visible. As I watched, the indentation slowly returned to normal, like memory foam recovering from pressure, but far too slowly for any normal material. The snoring had been replaced by something worse, the sound of someone trying not to breathe too loudly, the deliberate quiet breathing of someone pretending to be asleep while actually watching and waiting. I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. The sensation was so intense that my skin crawled, every nerve-ending screaming that I was being observed by something that shouldn't exist. I backed out of the room slowly, not daring to turn my back on bed 4. As I reached the doorway, I heard a sound that stopped my heart. the unmistakable creak of bed springs as someone sat up. I spun around, but the bed appeared empty, yet the impression remained, the sense of a presence watching me with patience that felt both ancient and malevolent. The monitors continued their synchronized 45 BPM pulse, the sound of electronic heartbeats filling the silence like a countdown to something terrible. That was when I understood the truth, though understanding brought no comfort. Harrison Thorne had never left room 412. He had been removed from the records, erased from official existence, but something had kept him here. Whether through his own stubborn refusal to acknowledge death, the facility's unwillingness to document his passing, or some darker administrative decision to simply pretend he had never existed, he remained. The bed that couldn't be moved, the pulse that appeared in darkness, the gradual strengthening of his presence, all of it pointed to a man who had been too aggressive, too difficult to control, even in death. A patient who had been administratively erased rather than properly processed, creating a bureaucratic limbo that had somehow become literally real. But knowing the truth didn't provide solutions. How do you discharge someone who was never officially admitted? How do you process the death of someone who was never acknowledged as having died? The system had created a loop, a gap in reality where Harrison Thorne existed in permanent suspension, neither alive nor dead, neither present nor absent. As I completed my rounds that night, I noticed something that chilled me more than anything else. My own behavior was being documented. Subtle notes in my personnel file about equipment complaints, unusual requests, and reports of phantom readings. The same pattern that had preceded the transfers and terminations of my predecessors. I was being positioned for removal, just as they had been. Soon, I would either accept a transfer to another facility or find myself unemployed, replaced by someone new who would start the cycle over again. Someone else would discover the impossible presence in bed 4, would try to investigate, would eventually be removed when their questions became too persistent. The administration knew. They had always known. Room 412 was a problem they managed rather than solved, containing Harrison Thorne by containing anyone who became too aware of his presence. The staff turnover wasn't coincidental. It was systematic, ensuring that no one stayed long enough to fully understand what they were dealing with. On my last night at Willowbrook, I sat in the nurse's station watching the monitors. The phantom 45 BPM reading had become constant now, no longer disappearing when the lights came on. Harrison Thorne was growing stronger, more confident, more real with each passing day. Soon he would be substantial enough that the next nurse wouldn't need to strain to see him. Soon the administration would need a new strategy for containing what they had created through willful ignorance and bureaucratic cowardice. As dawn approached, I gathered my personal belongings and prepared to leave. I'd been offered a position at a facility across town, a lateral transfer that would keep me employed while removing me from the problem they couldn't acknowledge. I would take it, because the alternative was unemployment and the certainty that nothing would change. But as I walked past room 412 for the final time, I saw something that made me understand the true scope of what was happening. The bed wasn't empty anymore. Even with the lights on, even in the growing daylight, a faint outline was visible against the white sheets. Not clear enough to make out features, but unmistakably human-shaped. Harrison Thorne was becoming visible, crossing back into a reality that had tried to erase him. The 3 other residents would be moved soon, I realized. Some administrative excuse would be found. Renovations, perhaps, or building maintenance. Room 412 would be temporarily closed, and when it reopened, it would have only one bed. A bed for a patient who had never been discharged, who would finally be acknowledged through the simple act of giving him a room to himself. I left my key card on the nurse's station counter and walked toward the elevator. Behind me, I could hear the steady sound of breathing from room 412. No longer trying to hide, no longer confined to darkness. Harrison Thorne had won through simple persistence, outlasting every attempt to erase him by refusing to be erased. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, carrying me away from Willowbrook and toward my new assignment. But I knew the pattern would continue. There would be other facilities, other rooms, other patients who had been administratively disappeared rather than properly processed. The system created its own ghosts, and I had been trained to be their keeper, moving from place to place to manage what could never be solved. As the building disappeared behind me, I wondered about my replacement, some young nursing technician who would start night shifts next week and gradually discover the impossible presence in bed 4. They would go through the same cycle of disbelief, investigation, and removal that I had experienced, that my predecessors had experienced. The system was perfect in its imperfection, creating problems it could never acknowledge while ensuring those problems never grew large enough to threaten the larger institution. Harrison Thorne would remain in room 412, growing more real with each passing day, until the administration finally accepted what they had created and gave him the formal acknowledgement he had been seeking all along. But that acceptance would come too late for the new nurse, just as it had come too late for me. The cycle would continue, perpetual and perfect, maintained by the willful blindness of those who preferred administrative convenience to confronting the impossible things that sometimes refused to stay buried in paperwork. In my car mirror, Willowbrook Geriatric Care looked like any other medical facility. Clean, professional, dedicated to the care of the elderly. But I knew better now. Some patients never leave, and some problems are never solved. They're simply managed, contained, and passed from one person to the next, ensuring that the truth remains buried beneath layers of transferred personnel and misplaced files. Harrison Thorne had taught me that death was not always the end, and bureaucracy was not always the solution. Sometimes, being erased from existence was just the beginning of a longer, stranger story, one that played out in night shifts and phantom vital signs, in empty beds that were never really empty, and in the careful silence of administrators who knew exactly what they were managing and chose to manage it rather than confront it. The road ahead led to my new assignment, my new facility, my new set of impossible patients who existed in the gaps between official documentation and human reality. The work would continue, because the work was never really about healing or care. It was about containment, about managing the unmanageable until it became someone else's problem. But somewhere behind me, in room 412, Harrison Thorne was settling in for another night of not quite sleep. His 45 BPM pulse steady and strong on monitors that would never again be able to pretend he wasn't there. He had won the war of attrition against bureaucracy itself, and his victory was measured in the quiet persistence of a heart that refused to stop beating, even when everyone had agreed to pretend it had never started. Story 6. In the first time I heard her voice, I thought it was dispatch testing the emergency channel. 3 weeks into my rotation at Millfield Correctional's disciplinary block, I'd grown accustomed to the static-filled communications that crackled through my radio during the midnight rounds. The old building seemed to swallow radio waves whole, spitting them back out distorted and weak. But this transmission cut through the interference with crystal clarity. Post 6. Post 6. Do you copy? I paused mid-stride in the narrow corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like dying insects. The voice was distinctly feminine, soft yet urgent, carrying an echo that suggested she was speaking from somewhere deep and enclosed. I keyed my radio, checking the channel display. Emergency frequency 7. This is post 6. Go ahead. Silence stretched for 30 seconds. Then the lights flickered, and I felt the first touch of cold against my face. It started as a gentle chill, like walking past an open freezer, but within moments the temperature plummeted. My breath formed visible clouds as I exhaled, and I could hear the metal door frames beginning to contract with sharp pings and creaks. The sound reminded me of a house settling in winter, except this was July in Georgia, and the prison's ancient air conditioning system had been struggling to keep the temperature below 80 degrees all week. That's when I noticed the ice. Delicate crystalline patterns spread across the cell door nearest to me, forming intricate geometries that seemed to pulse and shift in my peripheral vision. The formations looked almost organic, like frost flowers blooming in fast forward, and they traced a peculiar wave-like pattern that repeated every few inches along the metal bars. I blinked hard, certain the long hours were playing tricks on my vision, but the ice remained. More concerning was how it seemed to concentrate around my position, growing thicker and more elaborate the longer I stood there. The cells 20 feet in either direction showed no signs of the strange frost, remaining stubbornly normal in the oppressive Georgia heat. "Who is this?" I whispered into my radio, but received only static in response. The cold intensified, and I could feel it seeping through my uniform, settling into my bones with an ache that reminded me of childhood winters in Minnesota. My radio crackled again, and the voice returned, clearer now and tinged with something that might have been relief. "Someone can hear me. Finally, someone can hear me." I fumbled for my incident report pad, but my fingers had grown clumsy with cold. The ice patterns on the door had spread to encompass the entire frame now, and I could swear they were moving, shifting like living things responding to the cadence of the woman's voice. Each word seemed to trigger a new wave of crystalline growth, as if her transmission was somehow imprinting itself onto the metal in frozen form. "Identify yourself," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "What's your badge number and location?" Laughter drifted through the static, hollow and echoing. "Badge number? I don't think they issued those where I'm calling from." The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath coming in heavy puffs now. Ice began forming on the concrete floor around my boots, spreading outward in concentric circles. The pattern was hypnotic, almost beautiful, but there was something fundamentally wrong about watching water freeze in 90-degree weather. My training kicked in, and I started backing toward the checkpoint desk, keying my radio to the main dispatch frequency. "Control, this is Post 6. I'm experiencing some kind of environmental anomaly in D block. Request maintenance and..." The transmission cut to static before I could finish. When I switched back to frequency 7, the woman's voice was waiting. "Please don't leave. They promised me I could go when someone finally heard me, when someone listened. You're the first one who's answered in so long." I stopped retreating, something in her tone triggering a response I couldn't quite name. There was a desperate loneliness in those words that resonated uncomfortably with my own recent experiences. 3 weeks of 12-hour shifts in this place had left me feeling isolated and disconnected, surrounded by concrete and steel and the constant low hum of institutional machinery. The idea of someone being trapped, truly trapped, with only a radio as their lifeline struck closer to home than I cared to admit. "Where are you calling from?" I asked, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. "Cold. So cold here. The walls sweat ice, and my breath comes out in clouds thick enough to hide in. They said I'd earned this, said I'd understand eventually. But I've been good. I've been so good, and still they keep me here in the deep place where sound doesn't travel right." The ice around me had begun forming more complex structures now, delicate spires and bridges that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in rainbow fragments. I found myself studying the patterns, trying to understand the underlying logic that seemed to guide their growth. There was definitely a rhythm to it, a mathematical precision that reminded me of the waveform displays I'd seen in electronics class years ago. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me your exact location. Are you in the facility? Are you injured?" "Injured?" The voice carried a note of confusion. "I don't think that's the right word anymore. Changed, maybe. Altered. The cold does things to you after a while, makes you into something different. But I can still remember warmth, still remember what it felt like to be real." A chill that had nothing to do with temperature ran down my spine. I keyed my radio again, switching between all available frequencies, but the main dispatch seemed to have gone completely dead. Even the constant background chatter that usually filled the airwaves had fallen silent, leaving only the woman's voice on frequency 7 and the sound of ice forming in impossible configurations around my feet. "Listen," I said, trying to inject authority into my voice despite the growing strangeness of the situation. "I'm going to contact my supervisor and get someone down here to help you. But I need more information. What's your name?" "Names," she murmured, and I could hear what sounded like wind in the background of her transmission, a low moaning that seemed to come from somewhere very far away. "They took my name when they brought me to the deep place. But you can call me Echo, if you need something to hold on to. That's what I've become, isn't it? Just an echo bouncing around in the dark, waiting for someone to hear me clearly enough to answer back." The ice formations had reached chest height now, creating an intricate cathedral of frozen water around me. I should have been panicking, should have been running for help, but something about the geometric beauty of the structures held me transfixed. They pulsed with a soft inner light that seemed to synchronize with the woman's voice, and I began to understand that I was looking at something far more complex than random ice crystals. I was looking at her voice made visible. "Echo," I said softly, testing the name. "How long have you been trying to reach someone?" Time moves differently in the cold. Could be days, could be decades. I remember the others complaining about the temperature before everything changed, before the walls started weeping ice and the air turned thick enough to see. They said there would be warmth again, said someone would come to listen and understand. But the warmth only comes when someone hears me clearly, when the frequency finds its proper match. I pulled out my incident notebook with numb fingers, suddenly remembering something from my orientation briefing. There had been mention of historical records, archived materials from the facility's early days that new guards were supposed to review. I'd been putting it off, focused on learning the daily routines and emergency procedures, but now it seemed urgently important. "Echo, what year do you think it is?" Static filled the silence for so long that I thought she'd gone. Then her voice returned, smaller and more uncertain than before. "Year. The cold makes it hard to think about time. But there were others here when it started. Women in gray uniforms who talked about rights and justice and change. They were angry about something, planning something. Then the temperature dropped, and the planning stopped, and everything went quiet except for the ice growing on the walls. The pieces began forming a picture in my mind, vague and disturbing. I needed to get to those archives, needed to understand what had happened in this facility's past. But as I started to move toward the checkpoint desk, the ice formations around me began to shift and crack. The temperature spiked upward briefly, and I heard Echo's voice take on a note of panic. "Don't leave. Please. You're the first one who's understood the frequency. When you move away, the cold comes back worse than before. The ice gets thicker. The echo gets fainter. I can feel myself disappearing again." I stopped, torn between professional duty and something I couldn't quite name. The ice around me solidified again as I remained stationary, and I could feel the temperature stabilizing at somewhere just above freezing. It occurred to me that my position might be important, that there could be some kind of resonance effect happening between my location and her transmission. "I'm not leaving," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was lying. "But I need to understand what's happening here. Can you tell me about the other women you mentioned?" "They were like me once, warm and solid and real. But the cold got into them during the trouble, during the time when the walls started changing. Some of them fought it longer than others, but eventually we all became echoes, voices bouncing around in the deep place where sound doesn't travel right." The implications of her words sent a different kind of chill through me. I forced myself to think logically, to consider mundane explanations for what I was experiencing. Hallucinations brought on by stress and sleep deprivation, a heating system malfunction that could explain the temperature drop, maybe even an elaborate prank by senior guards testing the new guy's resolve. But the ice was real. I could touch it, could see my reflection distorted in its crystalline surfaces. And Echo's voice had a quality that I'd never heard in any recording or transmission, a depth and resonance that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than electronic speakers could produce. "The trouble you mentioned," I said carefully. "Can you describe it?" "Anger. So much anger about the conditions, about the way they treated us. The women organized, planned to make their voices heard. But when they gathered to act, the cold came down like a curtain, and the anger froze in their throats. Those who tried to speak found their words turning to ice before they could escape. Those who tried to move discovered their feet had frozen to the floor. I thought about the wave patterns in the ice, about how they seemed to respond to the rhythm of her voice. It was as if the frozen formations were trying to preserve something, to hold on to words and thoughts and feelings that had been interrupted mid-expression. "You said they promised you could leave when someone listened. Who made that promise?" "The ones who built the deep place, who made the walls that weep ice. They said the cold was temporary, a way to cool down the anger until it could be controlled. But controlled anger isn't anger anymore, is it? It's just sadness wearing different clothes. I found myself studying the ice formations more carefully, looking for patterns within patterns. There was definitely something linguistic about their structure, as if they were trying to spell out words in a language I didn't quite understand. The more I focused on them, the more I could feel something like comprehension building in the back of my mind. Echo, what if I could find the right frequency? What if I could help you convert the cold back to warmth? The frequency. Her voice took on a note of hope that was almost painful to hear. Yes, there's a specific resonance that can reverse the process, but it has to be precise, exact. Too high and the ice shatters but reforms twice as thick. Too low and it spreads to everything around you. I keyed my radio, adjusting the frequency dial by tiny increments while watching the ice formations for any change. At 7.2 MHz, the patterns began to vibrate slightly. At 7.3, they started to glow with a warmer light. But at 7.4, they began to crack and fragment, and I could hear Echo's voice becoming strained. Careful. Too fast and the cold fights back. It doesn't want to let go of what it's captured. I backed the frequency down to 7.3 and held it steady. The ice around me began to emit a soft humming sound, like crystal glasses ringing in harmony. The temperature started to rise, slowly but perceptibly, and I could see the elaborate formations beginning to soften at their edges. "That's it," Echo whispered, her voice clearer now than it had ever been. "I can feel the warmth returning. I can remember what it was like to be real." But as the ice continued to melt, I began to hear something else in the background of her transmission. Other voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once in overlapping whispers. They were saying the same things over and over. They promised we could leave. They promised someone would listen. They promised the cold was temporary. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Echo wasn't alone in the deep place. She was one of many, and they had all been waiting for someone to find the right frequency, to convert their frozen words back into warmth and breath and life. "How many of you are there?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "All of us who were here during the trouble. All of us who got caught when the cold came down. We've been holding on to each other in the ice, keeping the echo alive, waiting for someone who could hear us clearly enough to understand." The ice formations around me were nearly gone now, leaving only small patches of frost that continued to glow with that strange inner light. But the temperature was still rising, and I could feel sweat beginning to form on my forehead despite the earlier chill. Something was wrong with the balance I'd achieved. "Echo, the frequency isn't stable. The warmth is increasing too fast." "I know," she said, and for the first time, there was sadness in her voice instead of hope. "The process can't be controlled once it starts. The cold wants to preserve us, but the warmth wants to set us free. There's no middle ground, no way to exist between the two states." I watched in growing alarm as the last of the ice vanished and the temperature continued to climb. The air around me began to shimmer with heat, and I could smell something burning in the walls themselves. The frequency on my radio started to drift upward on its own, as if the equipment was responding to forces beyond my control. "What happens if I can't stabilize it?" "Then we finally get to leave the deep place," Echo said simply. "But leaving means letting go of everything that kept us connected to this frequency, this moment, this conversation. We'll be free, but we'll also be gone." I frantically adjusted the radio controls, trying to find a stable setting that would maintain the connection without allowing the heat to build beyond containment. But the frequency kept drifting, and I could hear the other voices becoming clearer and more distinct in the background. They were saying goodbye. "Wait," I said desperately. "There has to be another way. You said someone promised you could leave when someone listened. Maybe listening is enough. Maybe you don't have to disappear." "Oh, sweetheart," Echo replied, and I could hear her smiling through the static. "You really have been listening, haven't you? You understood the frequency, helped us remember what warmth felt like. That's more than anyone's done for us in such a long time." The heat was becoming unbearable now, and I could see scorch marks beginning to appear on the walls around me. My radio crackled and popped as the circuits overloaded, but Echo's voice remained clear and steady. But listening was never about keeping us here. It was about acknowledging that we existed, that we mattered enough for someone to search for the right frequency and pay attention to what we were trying to say. You've given us that gift. The radio finally gave up with a shower of sparks, and the sudden silence was deafening. The temperature began to drop back toward normal, leaving me standing in a corridor that showed no signs of the ice formations or scorch marks I'd just witnessed. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something like flowers blooming after a long winter. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Then I remembered the archives. The records room in the basement took me 20 minutes to locate, and another 30 to find the files from 1974. When I finally pulled the incident reports from that year, my hands were shaking enough that I had to read each page twice to make sure I was understanding correctly. July 15, 1974. Multiple complaints from female inmates regarding sudden temperature drops in D block. Maintenance found no explanation for the phenomenon. July 18, 1974. Planned protest by female inmates regarding living conditions postponed due to weather-related complications in housing unit. July 23, 1974. Female inmates in D block reported missing after apparent containment system malfunction. Search efforts suspended due to dangerous atmospheric conditions in affected areas. July 30, 1974. D block sealed pending investigation into environmental hazards. Female housing transferred to temporary facilities off-site. I closed the file and sat back in the metal chair, trying to make sense of what I'd read. There was no mention of deaths, no record of what had happened to the women who'd been reported missing. Just a clinical description of a containment system malfunction and environmental hazards. But there was one more document, filed separately and marked with a classification I didn't recognize. A single page of handwritten notes, apparently from someone in the facility's research division. Subjects successfully transitioned to quantum echo state during temperature suppression event. Consciousness patterns preserved in crystalline matrix pending development of resonance extraction protocols. Recommend maintaining containment frequency at 7.3 MHz until retrieval methodology can be perfected. Below that, in different handwriting, retrieval methodology abandoned. Recommend permanent storage. And below that, in a third hand, someone will listen eventually. Someone will find the right frequency. I stared at the page for a long time, reading those final words over and over. They weren't part of the official report. They looked like something that had been added years later, in secret, by someone who knew what had really happened in D block. When I finally made it back to my post, everything was normal. The radio worked perfectly, picking up dispatch transmissions and routine communications from other guards. The temperature was a steady 78 degrees, and there was no sign that anything unusual had ever occurred in the corridor. But sometimes, late at night when the facility is quiet and the radio static is just right, I think I can hear something on frequency 7.3. Not words exactly, but something like music, warm and distant and free. And when I listen carefully, really carefully, I swear I can hear them saying thank you. The question that keeps me awake isn't whether what I experienced was real or just a manifestation of stress and sleep deprivation. The question is whether it matters. Because either way, someone was listening. And sometimes, that's the most important frequency of all. Story 7. The first thing you notice about the Sunset Palms Motel isn't the peeling paint or the broken neon sign hanging at a dejected angle. It's the silence. Not the peaceful kind you'd expect from an abandoned building, but something heavier. A silence that seems to press against your eardrums like water at depth. I'd been here 3 days now, supposedly keeping watch while the renovation crew took their extended weekend. The owner, Marlowe, had been vague about what exactly I was watching for. His weathered hands had trembled slightly when he handed me the keys, and he'd avoided looking directly at the building when he drove away. The rotary phone sat on the front desk like a relic from another era, its black bakelite surface unmarked by decades despite the dust coating everything else. Marlowe had mentioned it was connected only to the internal system, room-to-room calls, nothing more. A leftover from when guests actually stayed here, before whatever had happened. I was sorting through renovation reports when it started. The dial tone pierced the silence without warning. I looked up from the paperwork, certain I hadn't touched the phone. The rotary dial was moving on its own, clicking with deliberate precision. One number, then another. The mechanical sounds echoed through the empty lobby like gunshots. The sequence always ended the same way. 2 sixes. Click, 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 click. Room 66. When the dialing stopped, I found myself reaching for the handset before conscious thought could intervene. The receiver felt unnaturally warm against my ear. Hello? My voice sounded foreign in the vast emptiness. There was a pause. Not silence, but something alive and listening. Then I heard it. My own voice, delayed by what seemed like several seconds, speaking words I hadn't said. Amber weapon. The line went dead. I set the phone down with hands that had started to shake. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Old wiring, crossed connections. Some kind of echo effect from the building's acoustics. But logic felt thin here, stretched over something much larger and darker. I walked to the control panel mounted behind the desk. The maze of colored wires looked like the nervous system of some electronic creature, pulsing faintly with residual current. Everything appeared normal until I noticed the temperature. The area around the panel radiated heat like a furnace, though the rest of the lobby remained cold enough to see my breath. The phone rang again 20 minutes later. Same pattern, same sequence ending in 66, same impossible conversation with my own delayed voice. Amber weapon. This time when I hung up, a shower of golden sparks erupted from the control panel. They cascaded to the floor like dying fireflies, and where they landed on the burgundy carpet, they seemed to burn in the pattern of some symbol I couldn't quite identify. The smell of ozone and heated metal filled the air. I checked the renovation reports again, spreading them across the desk with growing urgency. Room 66 was supposed to have been demolished 6 months ago. The blueprints showed empty space where it had been, a gap in the building's skeleton. But I knew what I'd seen when I'd walked the halls yesterday. A door marked 66, ordinary except for the way shadows seemed to cling to its frame. The third call came as evening settled over the motel like a burial shroud. The golden sparks were more intense now, creating a constellation of tiny burns across the carpet. The symbol was becoming clearer. Concentric circles with radiating lines, like a stylized sun or eye. Amber weapon. My own voice, speaking words that felt important in a way I couldn't grasp. After hanging up, I noticed the panel wires glowing faintly orange, like heated metal. The building's electrical system was failing, that much was certain. But the pattern felt too deliberate, too purposeful to be random malfunction. I had to see the room. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, lined with doors that bore numbers climbing toward an impossible destination. 62, 63, 64, 65. The carpet beneath my feet showed the same burn pattern that was forming in the lobby, as if the building itself was developing some kind of fever. Room 66 stood at the end of the corridor, exactly where the report said empty space should be. The door was painted the same faded green as all the others, but something about it made my vision blur if I looked too directly. A standard brass knob and deadbolt, but below them hung a padlock I hadn't noticed before. The padlock was unlike anything I'd seen. Not metal, but what looked like amber-colored resin instead of numbers. Its surface showed a spectrum of colors arranged in a circle. The current setting pointed to deep blue. I tried my key in the deadbolt first. It slid in smoothly but wouldn't turn, as if the mechanism had fused solid. The amber padlock felt warm to the touch, almost alive. When I pressed different colors, they lit up with internal luminescence, but the lock remained stubbornly closed. Amber weapon. My own voice echoing in my memory. Amber wasn't just a color. It was a thing. Fossilized tree resin, ancient, preserving whatever was trapped inside for millions of years. And weapon? I pressed the amber-colored section of the padlock's face. The corridor lights flickered, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard something breathing on the other side of the door. But the lock didn't open. Back in the lobby, the phone was ringing again. The fourth call of the day. The sparks from the control panel were now coming in steady streams, and the carpet symbol was nearly complete. Definitely an eye, with intricate details forming in the burned fibers. The smell of electrical fire was getting stronger. Amber weapon. This time, after my delayed voice spoke those words, I heard something else. A sound like rustling paper or insects moving through dry leaves. It came from the phone itself, as if something was crawling through the copper wires. I slammed the handset down and backed away from the desk. The building felt different now, as if its geometry was shifting when I wasn't looking. The front door seemed farther away than it had been, and shadows moved in my peripheral vision with no light source to cast them. The renovation reports. I spread them out again, searching for anything about Amber, about room 66, about why a door that shouldn't exist was locked with a puzzle that required color instead of numbers. In the margins of one report, I found a handwritten note in faded ink. Project discontinued after discovery in room 66. Recommend immediate demolition and burial of artifacts. See attached inventory. There was no attached inventory, but another note, in different handwriting. Amber samples refuse to break. Attempts at dating inconclusive. Reading suggests specimens are older than should be possible. Interior objects remain perfectly preserved, despite obvious age of surrounding material. The phone rang again. I let it ring. The dial tone continued for nearly a minute before the automatic dialing began. Click, 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 click. Click, 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 click. Room 66. This time I didn't answer, but I heard my voice anyway, coming from the handset even though it remained in its cradle. Amber weapon. The sparks from the control panel formed a fountain of golden light that reached nearly to the ceiling. The eye symbol on the carpet was now complete and seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. And I realized with a sick certainty that made my stomach clench that the eye was looking at me. I ran to room 66. The hallway stretched endlessly, but somehow I was there in seconds, standing before the door with the amber padlock that held answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Amber weapon. Not amber, weapon. Amber as weapon. Amber containing weapon. I thought about fossilization, about things trapped for millions of years, preserved perfectly, waiting. About rooms that shouldn't exist containing artifacts that couldn't be dated or destroyed. The padlock had 8 color sections. I'd tried amber. But what if amber wasn't the color? What if amber was the prison, and the weapon was what was trapped inside? I pressed black. The lock clicked open. The door swung inward on hinges that moved without sound, revealing a room that defied the building's exterior dimensions. It stretched back much farther than should have been possible, filled with amber-colored formations that looked like frozen honey or crystallized time. Within each formation, shadows moved with deliberate purpose. In the center of the room sat an old rotary phone, identical to the one in the lobby. Its dial was moving on its own, creating sequences that had no connection to any numerical system I knew. And with each rotation, the amber formations pulsed brighter, and the shadows within them pressed closer to their translucent walls. I understood then that I'd been assuming the phone calls were coming from somewhere else, but the lobby phone wasn't receiving calls. It was making them. To here. To this room that existed outside normal space, where something had been waiting in fossilized patience for someone to solve the riddle of its prison. The phone in room 66 continued dialing, and with each sequence, I felt the building around me growing warmer. The electrical system wasn't failing. It was being overloaded by something drawing power it had never been designed to supply. Soon the lights would fail, the doors would lock, and I would be trapped in darkness with whatever was stretching against its amber walls. I backed toward the door, but the hallway beyond was gone. In its place stretched an endless corridor lined with identical doors, all marked 66, all standing slightly open. From behind each one came the sound of dialing, and my own voice speaking words I had never said, would never say, but somehow kept saying anyway. Amber weapon. The formations in the room began to crack. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what the world had looked like before I'd entered this place, before I'd heard the phone ring, before I'd taken a job watching over a building that shouldn't have been able to contain what it contained. But those memories felt like stories someone had told me about a different person, in a different life, in a different kind of reality, where phones only rang when someone was calling, and rooms only existed in the space their walls occupied. Behind my eyelids, golden sparks danced in the shape of an eye that was opening after millions of years of sleep, and somewhere in the darkness beyond thought, my own voice continued its patient recitation, calling to something that was finally ready to answer. Story 8. The camera's weight felt heavier with each step into the valley, though I'd carried the same gear through dozens of abandoned settlements before. Something about this place made my shoulders ache, maybe the way the morning fog clung to the skeletal remains of fences, or how the silence seemed too complete, as if the very air held its breath. I'd driven 3 hours from the city to reach this forgotten pocket of Colorado, following rumors of a colonial settlement that had been swallowed by the wilderness decades ago. The kind of place that made for haunting photographs and decent money from photography magazines that specialized in American ruins. My portfolio needed something with more edge, something that would set me apart from the weekend warriors with their digital cameras and Instagram filters. The GPS had given up on me 20 minutes ago, leaving only a dirt road that looked more like a suggestion than an actual path. But the valley spread before me now, dotted with the remains of perhaps a dozen structures in various states of decay. Most were little more than foundations and scattered timber, claimed by decades of harsh winters and summers that could split stone. But one house stood different from the rest. It perched on a slight rise near the valley's eastern slope, its wood siding weathered to the color of old bones but still intact. 2 stories with a steep roof that suggested an attic space beneath. The windows were dark but unbroken, and when I raised my camera for a preliminary shot, I noticed something odd in the viewfinder. Thin lines hung from various points around the structure, the eaves, the porch railing, a few windowsills. At first glance, they looked like decorative elements, maybe wind chimes or hanging plants. But as I walked closer, adjusting the telephoto lens for a better look, I realized they were rope fragments, dozens of them, all cut clean and hanging limp in the still air like the tongues of hanged men. The front door stood slightly ajar, which should have been my first warning to turn around. Instead, I found myself climbing the 3 wooden steps to the porch, my boots echoing hollowly against planks that shouldn't have been strong enough to support my weight after so many years of abandonment. But they held firm, as if the house had been waiting. I pushed the door open with my shoulder, keeping my hands free for the camera. The hinges moved smoothly, too smoothly for something that should have been rusted solid. The smell hit me immediately. Not the expected mustiness of decay, but something cleaner. Furniture polish, maybe, with an undertone of something I couldn't identify. The interior stopped me cold. Everything was perfectly preserved. A burgundy sofa sat facing a stone fireplace, its cushions barely compressed as if someone had just stood up from reading. Bookshelves lined one wall, their volumes neatly arranged by height. A grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its pendulum motionless, but its brass fittings polished to a warm gleam. But every rope in the house had been cut. The curtains hung in awkward folds where their pull cords had been severed. A plant in the corner drooped from its severed hanging line, somehow still alive despite lying in a ceramic pot on the floor. Even the clock's weights had been cut free, the chains ending in frayed stumps while the brass weights themselves sat arranged on the mantelpiece like metallic fruit. I raised the camera and began shooting, the familiar ritual helping to calm the unease that was building in my chest. The light coming through the windows was perfect, soft and golden, casting long shadows that gave depth to every frame. This was exactly what I'd been looking for, the kind of inexplicable preservation that would make editors take notice. As I moved through the first floor, I found more evidence of the rope cutting. Kitchen twine had been sliced away from a herb drying rack, leaving only short stubble where longer lengths should have hung. A child's swing hung motionless from the ceiling beam by just one rope, the other cut so precisely that the edge looked almost surgical. No, not a child's swing. The seat was too large, meant for an adult. The thought made my stomach clench for reasons I couldn't explain. The stairs to the second floor creaked under my weight, but again, that sound was wrong. Too musical, too deliberate. Like notes being played on an instrument made of wood and time. At the top, I found 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all maintained with the same impossible preservation as the floor below. But it was the pull-down ladder to the attic that made me stop breathing. Every other rope in the house had been cut, but the cord for the attic access hung intact, swaying almost imperceptibly in a breeze I couldn't feel. It moved like a pendulum, back and forth, as if counting down to something. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up my gear and get back to the car, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place that felt less abandoned and more waiting. But the photographer in me, the part that had driven me to seek out these forgotten places in the first place, couldn't resist the possibility of what might be hidden in that attic space. The light up there would be spectacular. Natural illumination filtering down through whatever windows or vents existed in the roof structure. It would be the perfect capstone to the shoot, the kind of dramatic final image that could anchor an entire gallery showing. I reached for the cord. The moment my fingers touched the rough hemp, the house seemed to exhale around me. Not a sound exactly, but a sensation, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath and finally allowed themselves to relax. The cord felt warm in my hand, almost pulse-like, and when I pulled, the ladder unfolded with surprising ease. The smell that wafted down from the opening was overwhelming. Damp fabric, yes, but underneath that something sweeter and more complex, like flowers that had been pressed between the pages of old books, or sachets forgotten in long-closed drawers. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was dense enough to make my eyes water. I climbed carefully, testing each rung before trusting it with my full weight. The attic space opened above me, larger than I'd expected, running the full length of the house. Weak light filtered through a circular window at the far end, painting everything in sepia tones that would have been perfect for photography, if not for what I found waiting in that soft illumination. Dolls hung from the rafters. No, not dolls. Figures made from cloth scraps and stuffing, roughly sewn together in the shape of men. They were dressed in clothing that had been hastily tailored, shirts with sleeves that didn't quite match, pants that bunched awkwardly at the waist. But the stitching was careful, almost loving, as if whoever had made them had taken great care despite working quickly. There were 7 of them in total, hanging at different heights from ropes that seemed newer than anything else in the house. They turned slowly in the still air, their blank faces catching and releasing the light from the far window. Each one wore a small patch of fabric sewn to its chest, and on each patch was embroidered a single letter, Martins, my surname, spelled out across 7 hanging figures in that suffocating attic space. The camera fell from my hands, clattering against the wooden floor. The sound echoed strangely in the confined space, multiplying until it seemed like a dozen cameras had fallen, then 100. I scrambled toward the ladder, my breath coming in short gasps, but before I could reach it, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Creaking, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below. Not the random settling of old wood, but the specific sound of ropes under tension, as if every severed line in the house was slowly, deliberately being pulled taut again. I forced myself to peer down through the attic opening. The hallway below looked the same, but the shadows seemed deeper now, and when I looked toward the stairs, I could see that the single remaining rope of that adult swing was moving. Not swaying, moving, stretching and contracting like a muscle, or like something was testing its strength. More sounds joined the first, the grinding of pulleys that shouldn't exist, the whisper of rope sliding through metal guides. From somewhere in the walls came the distinctive snap of cordage under sudden tension, followed by a satisfied settling, as if pieces of an enormous puzzle were clicking into place. I had to get down, had to get out of the house before whatever was happening finished happening. But as I swung my leg toward the ladder, I made the mistake of looking down at my own shadow cast across the attic floor by the light from the window. It was wrong. Not just wrong, incomplete. The shadow of my left foot was missing entirely, and the edge of my right leg's shadow seemed frayed, as if it were coming apart at the seams. As I watched, a thin line of darkness peeled away from my shadow's shoulder and began to drift toward one of the hanging figures. That's when I understood. The ropes weren't just being retied, they were being woven into something larger, something that included me. Each restored connection took a piece of my shadow, my essence, and bound it into the house itself. I was being stitched into place, one thread at a time. I dropped through the opening without using the ladder, hitting the hallway floor hard enough to jar my teeth. The impact should have hurt more than it did, but there was a strange cushioning effect, as if the house itself was trying to keep me intact, unbroken. The stairs stretched before me, but they looked longer now, the angles subtly wrong. As I ran toward them, I could hear more ropes snapping into position throughout the house. The curtains in the bedrooms were sliding closed on their newly restored pull cords. The grandfather clock had begun to tick, its weights swinging on chains that gleamed with impossible newness. But worst of all was the sound from behind me, the gentle creaking of 7 figures swaying in perfect unison in the attic above. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my shadow streaming behind me like smoke. In the periphery of my vision, I could see thin tendrils of darkness being drawn away, absorbed into the walls and furniture around me. The burgundy sofa seemed to pulse with a life that wasn't its own. The books on their shelves rustled pages that no wind could have touched. The front door was still open, exactly as I'd left it, but the rectangle of daylight beyond looked somehow smaller than before. The porch seemed miles away instead of mere steps, but I ran toward it anyway, because the alternative was to become another figure hanging in that attic, another letter in someone else's name. I made it to the threshold before the final rope snapped into place. The sound was like a gunshot, sharp and definitive, and with it came a sensation I will never be able to adequately describe. It was like being pulled backward through thick syrup. Every molecule of my being dragged towards something that wanted to own me completely. My shadow, what remained of it, stretched impossibly thin between my feet and the dark interior of the house. For a moment I was caught between 2 states. Part of me still standing in the doorway, part of me already woven into the fabric of that impossible place. I could feel the house's hunger, its desperate need for completion. It had been waiting so long for someone with the right name, the right configuration of letters that would allow it to finish whatever work had begun there. But something saved me. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't touched any of the other ropes, that I'd been careful to avoid every hanging strand except for the attic cord. Maybe it was simple luck, or maybe the house wasn't quite ready, hadn't accumulated enough power to hold someone as strongly anchored to the outside world as I was. The tension snapped. I stumbled forward onto the porch, gasping like a drowning man who'd just reached the surface. Behind me, the house settled with a sound like a disappointed sigh. When I turned to look back, the front door was closed, though I hadn't heard it swing shut. But my shadow was wrong. It moved a fraction of a second behind my movements, as if it were being pulled through thick liquid. And when I raised my hand to shield my eyes from the sun, I could see thin threads of darkness still connecting me to the house, visible only at certain angles, like spider silk caught in the light. I ran to my car without looking back again, threw my equipment into the back seat, and drove until the valley was far behind me. But even now, 3 months later, those threads are still there. I can feel them tugging at me sometimes, especially at dusk when the shadows grow long. My photographs from that day came out perfectly, every shot crystal clear except for the ones I took in the attic. Those show only empty rafters and dusty air, as if the hanging figures had never existed at all. But sometimes, when the light hits the photos just right, I can make out 7 faint outlines against the background. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet enough, I can hear them swaying. I've been back to that valley 3 times now, following the same dirt road, retracing my exact route. but I can never find the house again. The GPS still gives up at the same spot, and the valley still spreads before me dotted with ruins. But that particular structure, the one with its impossible preservation and its hunger for completion, remains hidden. Maybe it's waiting for me to bring the right equipment, the right mindset. Maybe it knows I'll eventually stop fighting the pull of those invisible threads and come back to finish what we started. Or maybe it's already found someone else with the right letters in their name, someone less careful about which ropes they touch. I hope, for their sake, they learn to run faster than I did. But sometimes, when my shadow moves just a little too slowly, I think I can hear 7 voices calling my name from a place that exists somewhere between memory and nightmare. And I know that eventually I'm going to have to go back and answer them. After all, some things are designed to be completed, and I can feel myself unraveling, one thread at a time. Story 9. The fluorescent lights in St. Agnes emergency room buzzed with the persistence of trapped insects, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made healthy people look corpse pale. I'd been working here exactly 6 days when Margaret Voss, the night supervisor, cornered me by the medication lockup. Margaret had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen too much and trusted too little. Deep-set eyes that seemed to catalog every movement, every breath you took. She never smiled, never made small talk, and had a way of appearing beside you without making a sound. Thompson. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd been running night shifts since before I was born. You're not walking home anymore. Not after 11. I paused in my inventory count, pen suspended over the clipboard. Excuse me. The night shift extra coverage. She leaned closer, and I caught the scent of industrial soap and something medicinal. They like mail company. You take the bus or you call a cab, but you don't walk those streets alone. The phrase hung in the stale recycled air like a diagnosis I didn't understand. Night shift extra coverage? I'd been through all the orientation materials, studied every protocol manual they'd given me. There was no mention of additional coverage. I'm not sure I follow, but Margaret had already turned away, her white shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum as she disappeared around the corner toward the nurse's station. That was Margaret's way. Drop a cryptic warning and vanish before you could ask for clarification. For the next 3 nights, I dutifully took the 47 bus home, watching the industrial district blur past the grimy windows. Smokestacks and storage tanks stood like sentinels against the orange glow of sodium lights, while the smell of chemical processing plants seeped through the bus's rattling vents. Each night, I found myself scanning the empty sidewalks we passed, wondering what exactly Margaret thought I might encounter out there. The 4th night changed everything. I was halfway home when I realized I'd left my umbrella in the break room locker. Dark clouds had been gathering all evening, and the weather app on my phone showed thunderstorms moving in. The next bus wouldn't arrive for another 40 minutes, long enough to get thoroughly soaked. Against my better judgment, and Margaret's cryptic warning, I walked back. The hospital after midnight transformed into something entirely different. During the day, St. Agnes buzzed with controlled chaos, ambulance sirens, overhead pages, the constant shuffle of staff and visitors. But at 12:30 a.m., the building seemed to hold its breath. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridors like gunshots, amplified by the high ceilings and bare walls. The employee entrance required my badge swipe, and the electronic beep seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Inside, emergency lighting cast long shadows that seemed to shift and move as I passed. The main elevators were shut down for the night, so I took the service stairs to the 3rd floor where the staff lockers were housed. That's when I heard it. The PA system crackled to life, and my own voice filled the empty corridors. Attention all staff. Security Protocol 77 Alpha is now in effect. All personnel must remain at designated stations until further notice. I stopped dead on the stairwell landing, my hand gripping the cold metal railing. The voice was definitely mine. The same slight rasp from too many years of cigarettes, the same New England accent I'd tried unsuccessfully to soften. But I had never made that announcement. I'd never even heard of Protocol 77 Alpha. The announcement repeated, echoing through the empty halls with a mechanical precision that made my skin crawl. I waited for it to end, for silence to return, but it just kept cycling. The same words, the same inflection, like a broken record player stuck in an endless loop. I climbed the remaining stairs 2 at a time, desperate to reach the locker room and get out. But as I pushed through the fire door onto the 3rd floor, the overhead lights began to flicker in sequence. First the ones nearest the stairwell, then marching down the corridor like dominoes falling in slow motion. My reflection caught my eye in the darkened windows that lined the hallway. For a split second, I saw myself as I was. Tired, slightly disheveled, wearing the navy blue scrubs that marked me as ER staff. But then the lights flickered again, and in that strobing illumination my reflection seemed wrong somehow. The figure in the glass wore my face, my scrubs, but there was something else. A translucent mask or breathing apparatus that obscured the features, making them indistinct and shifting. I blinked hard, shook my head, looked again. Just my normal reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed in the fluorescent glare. The locker room felt like a tomb. My footsteps were muffled by the industrial carpeting, and the only sound was the persistent hum of the ventilation system. I found my locker, spun the combination with trembling fingers, and grabbed my umbrella from the top shelf. That's when I noticed the clipboard hanging beside the time clock station. It shouldn't have been there. The electronic system had replaced manual timesheets years ago. Everyone badged in and out using their ID cards. But there it was, a metal clipboard with actual paper timesheets, filled out in handwriting I didn't recognize. Curiosity overrode caution. I approached the clipboard and lifted the top sheet. My name was there, written in a neat, unfamiliar script. Thompson Daniel, night extra coverage. Below it, a series of time entries spanning the past 3 weeks, dates that preceded my hire date by 2 weeks. According to these records, I'd been working here since before I'd even applied for the job. Each entry was identical. Clock in at 3:33 a.m., no clock out time. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, week after week of the same entries, always starting at 3:33, never ending. Some sort of error in the system, I told myself. A clerical mistake, maybe confusion with another employee who had a similar name. But as I studied the handwriting more closely, a chill ran down my spine. The script was mine, the same way I dotted my I's and crossed my T's, the same slight leftward slant I'd had since childhood. Someone had been forging my signature, or... The PA system crackled again, and once more my voice filled the empty corridors. Attention all staff. Security Protocol 77 Alpha is now in effect. All personnel must remain at designated stations until further notice. This time, I paid closer attention to the words. They were spoken with the exact rhythm and cadence I used when I was exhausted, running on automatic pilot during those endless double shifts I'd worked at my previous hospital. It wasn't just my voice, it was me, speaking with the weary authority of someone who'd been doing this job far longer than 4 days. I had to get out. I clutched the umbrella and headed for the stairwell, but the elevator chimed behind me. Impossible. The elevators were shut down for the night. I turned to see the doors sliding open, revealing an empty car with harsh fluorescent lighting that seemed somehow different from the rest of the building's illumination. Inside the elevator, mounted beside the button panel, was another time clock. This one was older, mechanical rather than electronic, with a large lever arm and a slot for time cards. A stack of cards sat in the holder beside it, and the top one bore my name in that same, familiar yet strange handwriting. I approached slowly, as if the elevator might suddenly close and trap me inside. The time card was thick, yellowed with age, and completely filled out. Months of entries, all in my handwriting, all beginning at 3:33 a.m. and never ending. At the bottom, in red ink that seemed to glisten under the harsh lights, someone had written, "Permanent assignment, night extra coverage." The elevator doors began to close. I lunged forward and grabbed the time card, yanking it free just as the doors sealed shut. The elevator didn't move, just sat there, humming ominously, as if waiting for something. Looking at the card in my hands, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The entries weren't just in my handwriting, they were in my blood. The red ink had the dark, rust-colored hue of dried blood, and when I held the card closer to the light, I could see the faint impressions of fingerprints pressed into the cardboard. My fingerprints. The PA announcement started again, but this time there was a variation. Attention Daniel Thompson. Report to Time Clock Station 7 for shift assignment. Night extra coverage is mandatory for all matching personnel. Time Clock Station 7. I looked around the hallway, counting the stations mounted on the walls. There were only 6, numbered 1 through 6 in small metal placards. But at the far end of the corridor, near the emergency exit, another time clock had appeared. Its metal housing was tarnished with age, and the number 7 hung crookedly beside it. I walked toward it like a man approaching his own execution. Each step echoed in the empty hallway, competing with the endless loop of my recorded voice issuing instructions I'd never given. The time clock was ancient, probably from the 1950s, with a heavy mechanical mechanism that looked like it could punch through steel. There was already a time card inserted in the slot. My name was typed across the top in faded letters. Thompson, Daniel, Night Extra Coverage. Below it, a single time entry. Clock in, 3:33 a.m., followed by a date, today's date. I looked at my watch, 3:32 a.m. As the second hand swept toward the 12, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. Slow, deliberate footsteps that matched my own gait perfectly. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. Yet the footsteps continued, growing closer, accompanied by the soft rustle of scrubs and the squeak of hospital shoes against linoleum. 3:33 a.m. The time clock activated with a loud mechanical chunk that reverberated through the corridor like a gunshot. The time card ejected from the slot, fluttering to the floor at my feet. When I bent to pick it up, I saw that it now showed a clock-out time. 3:33 a.m. written in fresh red ink that was still wet to the touch. But I hadn't touched the machine. I hadn't punched anything. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I stood slowly, the bloody time card trembling in my hands, and turned around. The hallway stretched empty before me, but in the reflection of the window glass, I saw myself standing there. Except this version of me wore a breathing mask that obscured his features, and his scrubs were stained with something dark that could have been blood, or could have been shadows. The reflection raised its hand in a mockery of a wave, then pointed to its wrist where a watch should be. The gesture was clear. Time's up. I ran. Down the corridor, through the fire door, taking the stairs 3 at a time while my own voice echoed from the speakers. Attention all staff. Night extra coverage shift change is now complete. Regular personnel may resume normal duties. I burst through the employee entrance and into the cool night air, gasping as if I'd been underwater. Rain was beginning to fall, heavy drops that splattered against the concrete and filled the air with the smell of wet asphalt and ozone. Behind me, the hospital loomed like a monument to secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. But I could still hear it, even out here in the rain. The soft mechanical chunking of time clocks, punching entries for shifts that never ended, recording hours worked by people who may or may not exist. I still had the bloody time card clutched in my fist. The next morning I called in sick. Then I called my supervisor to request a transfer to day shift. When she asked why, I told her I'd had some health issues that made night work difficult. She seemed unsurprised, almost as if she'd been expecting the call. Margaret Voss left me a voicemail that afternoon. Her voice was carefully neutral, professional. Thompson, I see you've requested day shift. That's probably for the best. The night extra coverage position has been filled. I never went back to work nights at St. Agnes, but sometimes when I can't sleep, I drive past the hospital in the early morning hours. Through the windows on the 3rd floor, I can see figures moving in the corridors, staff members making their rounds, checking on equipment, going about the endless business of keeping people alive. Except the hospital doesn't run a night shift anymore. According to the official schedules, the building is minimally staffed after 11 p.m., with only security guards and emergency on-call personnel. Yet there they are, night after night, these dedicated healthcare workers tending to patients in wards that shouldn't be occupied, following protocols that don't officially exist. Sometimes I think I can see myself among them. A figure in navy blue scrubs moving purposefully through the halls, forever punching in at 3:33 a.m., forever fulfilling the obligations of a shift that never truly ends. The bloody time card is still in my wallet, though it's faded now to the color of old rust. Some nights I take it out and study the handwriting, trying to convince myself it's not mine. But I know better. Deep down, in the part of my mind that refuses to accept rational explanations, I understand that some part of me is still there, still working, still trapped in that endless loop of night extra coverage. Margaret Voss was right about one thing. The night shift does like mail company. They like it so much they never let you leave. Story 10. The night shift at Greyhound Terminal 47 had always been a sanctuary of predictable solitude. 23 years of watching empty platforms under fluorescent lights that hummed their mechanical lullabies, of checking locks and monitoring security feeds that showed nothing more exciting than occasional tumbleweeds of discarded newspapers. The terminal's heartbeat was steady. The distant rumble of interstate traffic, the periodic hiss of air brakes from late arrivals, the soft whisper of automatic doors opening and closing in their endless, purposeless dance. But at 3:17 a.m. on October 15th, something changed. The sound came first. Not the familiar diesel rumble of approaching buses, but a crystalline whisper, like wind chimes made of broken glass. I looked up from my crossword puzzle, pen frozen mid-word, as the sound grew closer. Through the terminal's tall windows, I watched a coach glide into Bay 7 with supernatural silence. Its movement so smooth it seemed to float rather than roll. Every surface of the vehicle gleamed with mirrors. Not the cheap decorative kind you'd see on carnival rides, but perfect, seamless glass that caught and multiplied the terminal's harsh lighting into 1,000 fractured stars. The bus appeared to be constructed entirely of reflective surfaces. Windows, doors, even the wheels seemed to shimmer with that same mirror-bright finish. I set down my coffee cup, the ceramic clicking against the security desk's metal surface like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. The interstate had gone silent. Even the fluorescent lights had stopped their eternal humming. The only sound was my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the vacuum of silence that had descended over the terminal. The coach's doors opened with a pneumatic sigh that echoed off the empty walls like a dying breath. No passengers emerged. No driver appeared. The interior should have been visible. Rows of seats, overhead compartments, the usual bus amenities. But instead, the doorway revealed an impossible corridor of reflections. The bus's mirrored interior captured the empty terminal platforms and multiplied them into infinity, creating a dizzying tunnel of fluorescent-lit emptiness that seemed to stretch beyond the physical dimensions of the vehicle itself. I stood slowly, my chair's wheels squeaking in protest. My reflection in the terminal's windows moved with me, but something was wrong with the image. The man in the glass appeared to be moving a fraction of a second before I did, as if my reflection was leading and I was following. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with the heels of my palms. Too much caffeine. Too many nights alone with nothing but my own thoughts for company. The destination display above the bus's windshield should have shown a city name, a route number, some indication of purpose. Instead, green LED digits flickered and reformed. 03/15/1967, my birth date. The numbers pulsed like a heartbeat, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that matched my own pulse. My mouth went dry. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me grounded through decades of night shifts and small-town monotony, scrambled for explanations. Coincidence? Equipment malfunction? Some elaborate prank by the day shift guys who thought the old security guard needed excitement in his life? But my hands were trembling as I reached for my phone, and the tremor had nothing to do with caffeine. I raised the device to photograph the impossible sight, but the screen showed something that made my stomach lurch. In the camera's display, my own face stared back at me, but it was wrong. My head appeared to be turned completely around, neck twisted at an angle that should have been fatal, my face looking backward over my shoulder while my body faced forward. I lowered the phone quickly, checking my reflection in the terminal windows. Normal. I raised the phone again. The backward-facing head reappeared in the camera's view. I dropped the device. It clattered across the floor, coming to rest near the vending machines, its screen now displaying nothing but static. 23 years of security work had taught me to document everything, to follow protocol, to maintain detailed logs of all unusual occurrences. I stumbled to my desk and pulled out the thick binder that contained decades of incident reports, my fingers fumbling through pages of minor vandalism, medical emergencies, and lost luggage claims. But as I flipped deeper into the archive, patterns began to emerge that made my skin crawl. October 15th, 1983. Incident report, 8:47. Unscheduled bus arrival at 0317 hours. Vehicle of unusual design, heavily mirrored exterior. No passengers or driver observed. Departed at 0343 hours without explanation. The report was signed by Marcus Webb, the security guard who had worked the night shift before me. October 15th, 1959. Handwritten log entry. Strange coach appeared tonight, covered in mirrors. Couldn't see inside proper, just reflections going on forever. Showed up at 17 past 3, left at 43 past. Destination sign showed my birthday. How is that possible? The shaky handwriting belonged to someone named Robert Hutchins. October 15th, 1927. A yellowed newspaper clipping tucked between pages. Mystery motor coach baffles terminal staff. The brief article described a mirror-clad omnibus that had appeared at the newly constructed bus depot, displaying personal information of night watchman Edmund Carey on its destination board. The mathematical progression was undeniable: 1927, 1959, 1983, 32-year intervals, then 24 years. If the pattern continued, the next gap should be 16 years. 1983 plus 16 equaled 1999. But it was 2015 now. The bus was 16 years late. Unless time moved differently for the mirror coach. Unless it existed in its own temporal framework, where mathematical progressions followed rules that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. I checked my watch. 3:31 a.m. 12 minutes until 3:43, when according to historical record, the bus would depart. Every fiber of my rational mind screamed that I should stay behind my desk, file another incident report, and let this supernatural impossibility pass into history like it had before. But something deeper, some primitive part of my consciousness that existed beyond logic and reason, whispered that this time was different. The mirror coach wasn't just visiting, it was waiting. I approached the vehicle slowly, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. The mirrors reflected my image from 1,000 angles, but each reflection was subtly wrong. In one, my hair was completely gray instead of salt and pepper. In another, deep lines creased my face, as if decades had passed in seconds. A third showed me younger, the eager rookie guard I'd been when I first started this job. The destination display continued its hypnotic pulse. 03:15, 1967, 03:15, 1967, 03:15, 1967. As I drew closer, additional text began scrolling beneath the date. Jacob Winters, Platform 7, choice required. That was my name. My real name, not the Jake that everyone called me. Jacob Winters, 48 years old, bachelor, career night security guard with no family and few friends. A man whose disappearance would barely register in the world's vast indifference. I reached the open doorway and peered into the infinite corridor of reflections. The mirrored interior created a tunnel effect that seemed to extend far beyond the physical constraints of the bus. Platform 7 repeated endlessly in the glass, empty benches and fluorescent lights, stretching toward a vanishing point that existed somewhere beyond comprehension. But as I stared deeper into the reflective maze, I began to notice figures in the distant reflections, shadowy forms that moved independently of my own image. 3:38 a.m. 5 minutes remained. I could feel the weight of decision pressing down on me like a physical force. The newspaper clipping had mentioned Edmund Carey, the night watchman from 1927. What had happened to him? The historical records contained no further mention of his name. No obituary, no forwarding address, no trace of his existence beyond that single night. The same gap existed for Robert Hutchins in 1959 and Marcus Webb in 1983. Three men who had encountered the mirror coach and then vanished from all records, as if they had never existed. But what if they hadn't vanished? What if they had made the choice I was now facing? The mirrors surrounding the doorway began to reflect movement that had nothing to do with my presence. In the glass surfaces, I could see myself boarding the bus, taking a seat in the infinite corridor, becoming part of the endless reflections. But I could also see myself backing away, reaching for something heavy, smashing the nearest mirror with desperate violence. Both futures existed simultaneously in the glass, playing out like alternative timelines waiting for me to choose which would become reality. 3:40 a.m. The bus's engine began to hum, though I had heard no driver board, seen no ignition. The mirrors started to vibrate slightly, creating a harmony of crystalline notes that seemed to resonate in my bones. The mathematical progression that had brought the coach to this moment demanded completion. If I boarded, would I break the cycle, become the guardian who ensured it never returned? Or would I simply become another missing night guard, another name erased from the historical record? If I broke the mirrors, would I trap myself in the coach forever, my consciousness scattered across 1,000 fragments of glass, paying the price for disrupting something that was never meant to be disrupted? 3:41 a.m. The infinite corridor of reflections began to shift. The distant figures in the glass grew closer, more distinct. I could make out their faces now. Edmund Carey, still wearing a 1920s watchman's uniform. Robert Hutchins in his 1950s security jacket. Marcus Webb with his 1980s mustache and thick-rimmed glasses. They weren't trapped or tortured. They looked peaceful, as if they had found something in the infinite reflections that the outside world could never offer. But their eyes held a warning, a message that transcended the barriers between decades and dimensions. They had chosen, and their choice had consequences that rippled through time itself. 3:42 a.m. The destination display changed one final time. Last call, Jacob Winters, choose. I stood at the threshold between the known and unknowable, between the safety of my mundane existence and the terrifying possibility of something beyond human comprehension. The mirrors reflected my indecision, showing me 1,000 different versions of myself, each making a different choice, each living with different consequences. The bus door began to close with agonizing slowness. 3:43 a.m. I moved. The next morning, the day shift supervisor found an empty security booth and a detailed incident report describing a mirror-covered bus that had appeared at Bay 7. The report was signed Jacob Winters and dated October 15, 2015, but no employee by that name appeared on any payroll records. The security cameras had malfunctioned between 3:17 and 3:43 a.m., showing nothing but static. The only physical evidence was a single spiderweb crack in one of the terminal's windows, a break in the glass that caught the morning light and fractured it into 1,000 tiny reflections, each one showing a slightly different view of the empty platform beyond. And sometimes, late at night, when the terminal fell into its deepest silence, maintenance workers reported hearing the distant sound of breaking glass echoing from nowhere at all. Story 11. The keys to Meridian Metallurgy felt heavier each night, their brass teeth worn smooth by decades of opening the same locks. I'd been pulling the midnight shift for 3 months now, ever since the plant shuttered operations and moved everything overseas. Corporate kept one man on payroll to walk the empty halls, check the sealed tanks, and ensure the ghosts of industrial progress didn't disturb the neighbors. Tonight felt different from my first step through the main entrance. The familiar smell of rust and old machine oil carried something else, a metallic sweetness that made my tongue feel thick. My footsteps echoed differently too, as if the cavernous space had grown larger in my absence. The safety lights cast their usual amber pools along the walkways, but the shadows between them seemed deeper, more patient. I began my rounds on the second level, where the control room overlooked the production floor. 23 tanks stretched below me like sleeping giants, their cylindrical forms connected by a network of pipes that resembled arteries in the dim light. Most were the standard 10,000-gallon models, but Tank 12 stood apart, a massive 25,000-gallon reactor that had been the pride of the facility before the environmental citations started piling up. The walkway creaked under my boots as I made my way toward the eastern wing. I'd learned to read the building's moods over these 3 months. Every settling beam, every expansion joint had its own voice. But as I approached Tank 12, a new sound emerged from beneath the familiar symphony of the old building. Singing. Male voices, maybe 6 or 8 of them, harmonizing in perfect unison. The melody was unfamiliar, almost liturgical, echoing from somewhere deep within the sealed tank. The acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint the source. The sound seemed to rise from the tank's depths and spiral upward through pipes that hadn't carried anything but stagnant air for 2 years. I stopped at the safety railing and listened. The voices grew stronger, more distinct. They weren't singing words exactly, but long, sustained notes that formed an alien harmony. The sound had a quality that made my chest feel hollow, as if the vibrations were reaching inside me and rearranging something fundamental. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I aimed it at Tank 12's access hatch. The singing stopped instantly, cut off so abruptly that my ears rang in the sudden silence. Then came the smell. Sharp, chemical, antiseptic. The kind of industrial cleaner that burns your nostrils and makes your eyes water. But Tank 12 had been sealed for over 2 years, its contents removed, and the interior supposedly inert. I checked my watch. 12:47 a.m., 5 hours and 13 minutes until my shift ended. The antiseptic smell faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, probably. The job market was brutal, and this night watchman position was all that stood between me and unemployment. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, manufacturing mysteries to make the long hours more bearable. I continued my route, checking the sealed access points and noting the readings on the environmental monitors. Everything appeared normal, but the building felt different tonight. The shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The ambient sounds, the settling of old steel, the whisper of air through the ventilation system, formed patterns that almost resembled voices. By 2 a.m., I'd completed the perimeter check and returned to the control room to file my hourly report. The room still smelled faintly of cigarettes and coffee, ghost scents from the men who used to monitor the production cycles around the clock. Bank after bank of switches and indicators lined the walls, most of them dark now, their functions irrelevant to a dead facility. I was reaching for the logbook when the first light appeared on panel C. A single red indicator, glowing softly in the darkness. Then another, this one amber. Within seconds, dozens of lights were flickering to life across the panel, creating a pattern that made my breath catch in my throat. It was an organizational chart. The lights formed neat rows and columns connected by illuminated pathways that represented reporting structures. At the top, a cluster of indicators spelled out management. Below that, supervisors. Then technicians, operators, and at the bottom, in a box all by itself, material processing. And there, in the material processing box, my name glowed in amber letters. David Carter. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating, but the lights remained, steady and undeniable. My name, spelled out in the same utilitarian font the plant had used for all its signage. Below my name, in smaller letters, was a designation I'd never seen before. Raw material, grade A. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Some kind of automated system I didn't know about. A malfunction causing random patterns. But the lights formed too coherent a structure, too specific a message. Someone or something had programmed this display specifically for me. I fumbled for the manual controls, trying to shut down the panel, but nothing responded. The organizational chart remained bright and steady, my name pulsing gently at the bottom like a heartbeat. That's when I heard the singing again. This time it came from multiple directions. Not just Tank 12, but from tanks throughout the facility. The voices had multiplied, creating a complex harmony that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. The sound was beautiful and terrible, like a choir of the damned performing for an audience of one. I left the control room and walked to the nearest tank, pressing my ear against the cool metal. The singing was definitely coming from inside, though the tank had been empty for years. The vibrations traveled through the steel and into my bones, making my teeth ache. The smell of antiseptic was stronger now, mixed with something else. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. The facility's lights began to flicker in rhythm with the singing, creating a strobing effect that made the shadows dance. I needed to find the original organizational chart. The thought hit me with sudden urgency, though I couldn't say why. The building's administrative offices were on the ground floor, in a section I rarely visited. If there were personnel files or organizational documents anywhere, they'd be there. The singing followed me as I descended the metal stairs, voices echoing from every tank I passed. The harmonies shifted and evolved, sometimes sounding human, sometimes resembling mechanical noises. The whistle of steam, the groan of stressed metal, the hiss of pressure release valves. The administrative wing smelled of dust and decay. Most of the offices had been stripped when the plant closed, but the main records room remained locked. I found the key on my ring, though I didn't remember receiving it or being told what it opened. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls like gray tombstones. I pulled open drawers at random, searching for anything that might resemble an organizational chart. Most contained procurement records, safety reports, and production logs. But in the bottom drawer of the last cabinet, I found a manila folder marked Personnel Structure, Confidential. My hands shook as I opened it. The chart inside was identical to the one displayed on the control panel, but with one crucial difference. In the original, the material processing box contained a different name, Marcus Webb. Below his name was the same designation, Raw Material, Grade A. A post-it note was attached to the chart in faded blue ink. M. Webb, Night Shift Supervisor. Recommended for processing after completion of familiarization period. Tank 12 prepared for integration. I flipped through the rest of the folder and found similar charts for other employees, each with their own processing recommendations. The dates were scattered across the plant's 40-year operational history. Dozens of names, all designated as raw material, all assigned to night shifts before their integration. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt oppressive. In that silence I heard something else. Footsteps on the metal walkways above me. Slow, deliberate steps moving toward Tank 12. I climbed the stairs two at a time, clutching the folder against my chest. The control room was exactly as I'd left it, the organizational chart still glowing on panel C. But now additional text was scrolling across a display I'd never seen activate before. Integration schedule, D. Carter, Aero 6 Tower hours. 6 o'clock, the end of my shift. I looked at my watch, 5:23 a.m. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by a sound I couldn't identify. Something like machinery warming up, gears engaging, systems coming online. Tank 12 was visible from the control room window, and as I watched, a faint light began to glow from within its sealed interior. The antiseptic smell was overwhelming now, mixed with ozone and something else, something organic and sweet, like flowers at a funeral. The lights on the control panel began to pulse faster, the organizational chart flickering between my name and Marcus Webb's, as if the system couldn't decide which reality to display. I thought about Marcus Webb, the night supervisor whose name had been on the original chart. Had he stood in this same room, watching the same display, feeling the same creeping certainty that something was terribly wrong? Had he heard the singing, smelled the antiseptic, felt the building's attention focusing on him like a predator sizing up prey? The display changed again. Preparation complete. Await further instructions. 5:45 a.m. I could leave. Walk out right now, never come back, find another job, pretend this never happened. But something kept me rooted in place. Not curiosity, but a growing certainty that leaving wasn't an option, that I'd been selected for something I didn't understand, recruited through a process that had been in motion long before I'd ever heard of meridian metallurgy. The singing resumed, softer now, almost gentle. It seemed to be calling me, guiding me towards something inevitable. The voices had faces now, or at least that's how it felt. Marcus Webb's voice, and the voices of all the others whose names had appeared on those charts over the years. They weren't warning me away, they were welcoming me home. 5:58 a.m. The control panel displayed a new message. Report to Tank 12 for integration. I walked toward the door, then stopped. The folder was still in my hands, the original organizational chart showing Marcus Webb's name where mine now appeared. Maybe if I could restore it somehow, replace my designation with his, return things to the way they were supposed to be. But as I looked at the chart more closely, I noticed something I'd missed before. In the top corner, in small faded print, Revision 247. 247 revisions. How many names had occupied that bottom box over the years? How many night supervisors had stood where I was standing, holding the same folder, making the same desperate calculations? 6 a.m. The lights in the control room went out, leaving only the amber glow from Panel C. In that glow, I could see my reflection in the window. Tired, confused, but somehow peaceful. The singing had become a lullaby now, soothing and familiar, like something I'd known all my life. I set the folder on the desk and walked toward Tank 12. With each step, the antiseptic smell grew stronger, more welcoming. The tank's access hatch was standing open now, though I didn't remember opening it. A warm amber light spilled from the opening, and the singing voices were clearest here, harmonizing in perfect welcome. As I climbed the ladder, I wondered if this was how it had always been meant to end. Maybe the job posting hadn't been random. Maybe I'd been selected long before I'd ever filled out an application, chosen through criteria I couldn't begin to understand. The last thing I remember clearly is the warmth of the light, the comfort of the voices, and the strange sense that I was finally where I belonged. Everything after that is unclear. Fragments of sensation, glimpses of purpose, the feeling of becoming part of something larger and more important than I'd ever imagined. When the day shift supervisor found the control room the next morning, Panel C was dark. The organizational chart was gone, the displays blank. According to the logbook, David Carter had completed his rounds at 5:47 a.m. and signed out normally at 6 a.m. But they never found him. And if you ask the new night supervisor, a young woman named Sarah Chen who started just 2 weeks later, she'll tell you she sometimes hears singing from Tank 12. Male voices, harmonizing in perfect unison, echoing through impossibly long pipes. She's learned not to point her flashlight at the tank when it happens. She's learned that some sounds are meant to be heard, not seen. And lately, she's been noticing that the lights in the control room sometimes flicker on by themselves, forming patterns that almost look like an organizational chart. She can't quite make out all the details yet, but she's pretty sure she can see her name at the bottom, in a box labeled Material Processing. The facility's been scheduled for demolition next month, but Sarah's been asked to stay on until then, to keep an eye on things during the final weeks. She's been told her shift ends at 6 a.m. She's been told a lot of things. Story 12. The fluorescent lights buzzed their familiar tune above me as I made my way through the empty terminal, clipboard in hand, checking off the last departures of the night. 4 a.m. inventory shifts had become routine over my 7 years supervising the yard at Interstate Station 47. But something about this particular morning felt different. The air hung heavier than usual, thick with an anticipation I couldn't name. I'd always prided myself on knowing every sound this place made, the distant hum of the refrigeration units in the food court, the occasional settling groan of the steel framework, even the subtle whistle the wind made when it caught the corner of Platform C just right. But tonight, beneath those familiar sounds, I heard something else. The low rumble of an engine idling somewhere in the yard. That shouldn't have been possible. The last scheduled departure had pulled out at 11:47 p.m., and incoming arrivals weren't due until 6:15 a.m. I'd personally checked the gate logs and security cameras before beginning my rounds, yet there it was, unmistakable. The steady throb of a diesel engine running somewhere beyond the main building. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the back exit, my footsteps echoing hollowly in the deserted terminal. The moment I pushed through the heavy steel door, I saw it. A bus sat idling at Gate 7, though the gate itself showed no record of entry. The vehicle was unlike anything in our usual fleet. An older model, probably from the 70s, painted in a dull white that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the harsh sodium lights overhead. No company logos adorned its sides, no route numbers or destination markers. Just blank institutional white that reminded me uncomfortably of hospital walls. As I approached, my breath began forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The temperature seemed to be dropping by the minute, though the weather service had forecast a mild October night. The bus sat perfectly still except for the gentle vibration of its idling engine, and I noticed something peculiar about the windows. They were tinted so darkly from the inside that I couldn't see through them, despite the vehicle's interior being clearly illuminated. I circled around to the front, expecting to find a driver, perhaps someone who'd gotten confused about schedules or gates. The driver's seat was empty, not just unoccupied, completely empty, as if no one had ever sat there. The steering wheel turned slowly, minutely, as if guided by invisible hands keeping the bus in perfect position. That's when I noticed the doors were open. Cool air rushed out from the interior, carrying with it the antiseptic smell of a medical facility. Above the entrance, a neon sign flickered to life. Coleta, in stark red letters. Collection. I'd seen that word before, though I couldn't immediately remember where. I climbed the 3 steps into the bus, my flashlight beam cutting through the artificial twilight within. What I found made me pause at the threshold, trying to process what I was seeing. The seats were all facing backwards. Every single passenger seat in the bus had been turned around to face the rear of the vehicle, creating an amphitheater effect that drew the eye inexorably toward the back wall. There, humming quietly between the last row of seats, sat a hospital-grade refrigeration unit, the kind used for transporting medical supplies, blood supplies. The refrigerator vibrated with mechanical precision, its compressor cycling on and off in a rhythm that seemed almost biological. A soft blue light emanated from its control panel, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. I found myself walking down the aisle toward it, my footsteps muffled by industrial carpeting that had seen decades of use. As I moved deeper into the bus, I became aware of something else, the sensation of being watched. Not by anyone visible, the bus was clearly empty except for myself, but by something just beyond the edge of perception. The feeling crawled up my spine like cold fingers, raising the hair on my arms despite the layers of my uniform jacket. I reached the refrigerator and noticed a clipboard hanging from a chain beside it. The top sheet was a requisition form, partially filled out in neat handwriting I didn't recognize. The quantity column showed a number that made my stomach clench: 47 units. The date was today's date. The time listed was 4:44 a.m., 44 minutes from now. I backed away from the refrigerator, suddenly desperate to get off the bus. But as I turned toward the exit, I heard something that made me freeze. The distinct sound of electronic systems powering down, coming from the direction of the main terminal. Through the bus windows, I watched as the lights in the building flickered and went out, section by section, like dominoes falling in reverse. My radio crackled to life with static, then fell silent. The emergency backup systems should have kicked in immediately, but the terminal remained dark. In the distance, I could hear the electronic chimes that meant the ticketing computers were rebooting, followed by the mechanical whir of printers starting up without input. I stumbled down the aisle toward the front of the bus, but stopped when my flashlight illuminated something I'd missed on my way in. A leather satchel tucked beneath the driver's seat. Inside, yellowed papers spilled out in disorganized piles. I pulled out the topmost document and recognized the letterhead of our regional medical center. It was a transportation protocol manual, dated 1973, with handwritten amendments spanning decades. The pages were filled with procedures for emergency collection services and critical shortage protocols. One section, highlighted in faded yellow marker, described a 3-flash signal system. Collata display flashing 3 times indicates immediate boarding protocol. All available units should report for collection within 20 minutes of signal initiation. My hands shook as I flipped through more pages. Incident reports from the 70s described a mysterious transportation service that appeared during medical emergencies. Flu outbreaks, industrial accidents, natural disasters, anything that depleted regional blood supplies. The reports mentioned the same details I was experiencing: unmarked white bus, backwards-facing seats, refrigeration unit, and a complete absence of any identifiable driver or company. But what made my blood run cold were the personnel reports. Dozens of them, spanning 5 decades, all describing employees who had encountered the bus and were never quite the same afterward. Some quit their jobs the next day. Others continued working but seemed hollow, distant, as if some essential part of them had been left behind. A few had vanished entirely, though security footage showed them walking calmly out of the station and into the night, never to return. The most recent report was dated 6 months ago, filed by my predecessor as yard supervisor. He discovered the bus during a similar early morning inventory, had climbed aboard to investigate, and had resigned the following week without explanation. His final entry in the log simply read, "Some collections aren't meant for the living to witness." Behind me, the refrigerator's compressor clicked off, and in the sudden silence, I heard something that made every nerve in my body scream. Footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps coming from outside the bus, approaching the open door. I switched off my flashlight and crouched low between the seats, peering through the darkened windows. A figure moved through the shadows of the yard, too distant and indistinct to make out clearly, but walking with the purposeful gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going. As it drew closer, I realized it wasn't walking on the asphalt. Its feet made no sound at all. It was gliding, moving with the fluid grace of something that had long ago forgotten the constraints of gravity. The footsteps, if they could be called that, stopped just outside the bus. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the shadows between the seats. The neon Collata sign began to flash. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it held steady, bathing the interior in pulsing red light. From somewhere in the terminal building, I heard the distant sound of doors opening and closing, followed by soft footsteps, real footsteps this time, moving through the corridors. Multiple sets of them, all heading in the same direction, toward the yard, toward the bus. I understood then what the manual meant by available units. The bus wasn't just a vehicle for transportation, it was a beacon calling to anyone within range who might serve its purpose. Employees working late shifts, security guards making rounds, even passengers stranded by delayed flights. Anyone whose blood type might match current needs. The refrigerator kicked back on, its compressor humming with renewed urgency. On its digital display, numbers began counting down. 23:17, 23:16, 23:15, 23 minutes until 4:44 a.m. I had a choice to make, and the weight of it pressed down on me like a physical thing. I could try to start the bus and drive it away from the terminal, hoping to break whatever hold it had on the approaching figures. Or I could stay, hide in the shadows between the seats, and witness what happened when those doors closed at 4:44. The footsteps outside grew louder, joined by others. I counted at least 6 distinct sets, all moving with the same unhurried determination. Through the windows, I caught glimpses of familiar faces. Janet from the night cleaning crew, Marcus from security, even old Tom who ran the newsstand and sometimes stayed late to restock. Their expressions were peaceful, almost serene, but their eyes reflected the red glow of the Collata sign with an intensity that seemed to come from within. They began boarding the bus, filing past my hiding spot with mechanical precision. None of them seemed to notice me crouched in the shadows, their attention focused entirely on the refrigerator at the back. They took their seats in the backwards-facing chairs, arranging themselves with the orderly calm of people who had done this many times before. Janet settled into the seat directly in front of me, so close I could have reached out and touched her shoulder. She stared straight ahead at the refrigerator, her breathing slow and steady. When I looked closely at her neck, I could see a small mark, barely visible, like a pinprick, just below her left ear. They all had the same mark. As the last of them took their seats, the bus doors closed with a soft pneumatic hiss. The engine's idle dropped to an almost inaudible whisper, and the interior lighting shifted from red to the clinical white of an operating room. The refrigerator's display showed 7:32, 7:31, 7:30, 7.5 minutes. I remained frozen in place, afraid that any movement might draw their attention, but more afraid of what I might see if I tried to leave. The passengers sat in perfect silence, their breathing synchronized, their eyes never leaving the refrigerator. Occasionally, one of them would reach up to touch the mark on their neck, and their expression would soften into something approaching bliss. At exactly 4:44 a.m., the refrigerator's compressor shut off with a final click. The silence that followed was absolute. No engine noise, no breathing, no sound at all except for the rapid beating of my own heart. Then slowly, the passengers began to stand. They moved in unison, like a choreographed dance, filing toward the back of the bus where the refrigerator waited. I couldn't see what happened next. My view was blocked by the seats and the bodies of the passengers, but I heard the soft mechanical sounds of the refrigerator opening and closing, followed by the quiet hum of its compressor restarting. When the passengers returned to their seats, each carried a small medical bag, the kind used for blood donations, filled with a dark liquid that caught the light like oil. The bus doors opened again, and one by one, they disembarked. As they passed my hiding spot, I caught glimpses of their faces. They looked younger somehow, refreshed, as if they had just awakened from a particularly restful sleep. The marks on their necks had faded to almost nothing. Janet was the last to leave. As she stepped off the bus, she paused and looked back, her eyes scanning the shadows where I crouched. For a moment, I thought she had seen me, but then she smiled, a peaceful, satisfied smile, and walked away into the pre-dawn darkness. The bus sat empty for several minutes after the last passenger departed. Then, without warning, the engine revved once and the vehicle began to move. It rolled slowly through the yard, navigating between parked buses and maintenance equipment with impossible precision, until it reached the main exit gate. The gate, which should have been locked and required a security code to open, swung wide without any input. The bus passed through and turned onto the empty highway, its taillights disappearing into the distance like dying stars. I remained hidden between the seats until the first rays of sunlight touched the terminal windows. Only then did I finally climb down from the bus that was no longer there, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. The terminal systems were back online, all the lights functioning normally. My radio crackled with the morning shift supervisor checking in, wondering why I hadn't responded to his earlier calls. The electronic displays showed normal operations resuming, with the first scheduled arrivals still hours away. In my pocket, I found something that shouldn't have been there. A small laminated card with my employee photo and a medical classification I didn't recognize. On the back, in the same neat handwriting I'd seen on the refrigerator clipboard, someone had written, "Collection scheduled. Next occurrence. TBD. Stand by for signal." I've been standing by for 3 weeks now, checking the yard every morning at 4 a.m., watching for signs of that white bus. The temperature hasn't dropped unexpectedly since that night, and the Coleta sign hasn't appeared on any of our regular fleet vehicles. But I've started noticing things. Small things. Janet still works the night cleaning shift, but she moves differently now, with a fluid grace that reminds me of how that figure glided through the shadows. Marcus has taken to volunteering for extra blood donations at the medical center, and Tom has installed a new refrigeration unit in his newsstand, the same model I saw on the bus. Sometimes late at night when I'm alone in the terminal, I catch myself touching the spot just below my left ear. There's nothing there yet, but I can feel something waiting, like a seed that hasn't quite decided whether to grow. The manual I found in the driver's satchel is gone now, along with all the incident reports and personnel files. But I remember what the last entry said about collections not being meant for the living to witness. I think I understand now what my predecessor meant. The living aren't meant to witness collections. They're meant to participate in them. The question isn't whether the bus will return, but whether I'll recognize the sound of its engine the next time I hear it calling. Whether I'll remember to be afraid when those familiar footsteps start walking toward the light. Story 13. The electromagnetic spectrum holds secrets we're not meant to discover. I learned this 3 weeks ago when I installed the prototype tracker in my sedan, a decision that now feels like opening a door I can never close again. The device hummed against the dashboard with the satisfied purr of precision engineering. Model RF7734, my own design, crafted for the military contract that would either make my career or end it. The LCD display glowed pale green in the dim interior, showing my coordinates with surgical accuracy: 41.2619 degree N, 95.8608 degree W. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m., and for those first few miles down Highway 6, everything felt perfectly normal. Normal. Such a fragile concept. The first anomaly appeared as I passed the rusted billboard advertising Mel's Auto Salvage. My coordinates flickered, just a millisecond of digital stuttering, before settling back to their steady march across the screen. I attributed it to electromagnetic interference from the high-voltage power lines running parallel to the road. Radio frequency technology is temperamental. Even a passing thundercloud can scramble delicate circuitry. But then I saw the rust-colored sedan in my rearview mirror. It materialized like heat shimmer on hot asphalt, wavering at the edges as if viewed through water. The vehicle occupied the exact same lane position as mine, maintaining perfect alignment despite the impossibility of two objects sharing identical space. My rational mind cataloged the details: faded paint job, cracked windshield, a dent in the driver's side door that caught the afternoon sunlight. Yet something fundamental felt wrong about its presence, as if reality itself struggled to accommodate this intrusion. The tracker's display flickered again. The coordinates remained unchanged, but the timestamp jumped forward 60 seconds. 2:48 p.m. became 2:49 p.m. in an instant, stealing a minute from my existence with casual indifference. I pulled over at the next rest stop, hands trembling as I lit a cigarette. The nicotine failed to calm my nerves. Through the windshield, I watched other vehicles pass on the highway, normal cars driven by normal people living normal lives. None of them seemed to notice the rust-colored sedan that had vanished the moment I stopped moving. The tracker's screen showed my stationary position with unwavering precision. The timestamp ticked forward at its proper pace, each second accounted for and displayed. I told myself I'd experienced a minor hallucination, perhaps triggered by fatigue or caffeine withdrawal. The missing minute must have been a simple display glitch, easily explained by faulty programming or hardware instability. I finished the cigarette and merged back onto the highway. The rust-colored sedan reappeared within minutes. This time, I forced myself to study it methodically. The vehicle maintained perfect synchronization with my movements, turning when I turned, accelerating when I accelerated. Its GPS coordinates, according to my tracker, matched mine exactly. No distance reading, no directional variance, as if both cars existed in the same quantum state. The driver remained a shadowy silhouette, never turning to acknowledge my presence despite our impossible proximity. Another minute vanished from the timestamp, then another. My mouth went dry as the implications settled over me like a burial shroud. Each overlap cost me time, not just displayed time, but actual temporal experience. The minutes weren't being skipped. They were being consumed, devoured by whatever force allowed two vehicles to occupy identical coordinates. I could feel their absence like missing teeth, leaving gaps in my consciousness that hurt to probe. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust that perfectly matched my phantom companion. I tried changing lanes, taking random exits, even driving in reverse for a few terrifying seconds, but nothing broke the connection. The rust-colored sedan followed with mechanical precision, its presence growing more solid with each passing mile. By sunset, I'd lost 17 minutes. The tracker's display showed clear signs of strain. The GPS coordinates occasionally scrambled into meaningless strings of numbers before snapping back to coherence. The screen flickered with increasing frequency, as if the device struggled to process data that violated its fundamental understanding of physics. Strange harmonics crept into the background hum, subsonic frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. I needed to find the calibration site before full darkness arrived. The manual specified an open field, free from metallic interference, where the antenna could be properly aligned. Only there could I restore the device to normal operation and break whatever unholy connection had formed between my world and the shadow realm of the rust-colored sedan. The off-ramp to County Road 47 appeared in my headlights like salvation itself. I took the exit at dangerous speed, tires screaming against asphalt as I fought to escape the highway's electromagnetic embrace. For a moment, the rust-colored sedan lagged behind, its outline wavering like a television picture losing signal strength. Hope flickered in my chest, premature and foolish. The phantom vehicle rounded the curve behind me, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness with predatory intensity. The distance between us collapsed to nothing as our GPS readings merged once again. Another minute disappeared from my timeline, followed quickly by 2 more. Time itself seemed to hemorrhage around the overlapping signals, bleeding away into whatever void existed between parallel coordinates. County Road 47 stretched ahead like a concrete tongue, leading deeper into farmland where cell towers gave way to grain silos, and electromagnetic interference faded to negligible levels. The perfect environment for calibration, the perfect environment for answers, or for something far worse than ignorance. My hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled desperation as the speedometer climbed past reasonable limits. The engine roared with mechanical protest, but the rust-colored sedan matched my pace effortlessly, its engine producing no sound at all. It moved with the silent inevitability of fate itself, immune to the laws governing normal vehicles. The tracker's display began cycling through error messages in rapid succession. Signal overlap, temporal variance, coordinate conflict. Each warning flashed in angry red letters before dissolving into static. The device was dying, overwhelmed by data that challenged its core programming. Soon it would fail completely, leaving me blind to the supernatural mechanics governing this encounter. I'd lost 31 minutes when the calibration field came into view. The meadow stretched for acres on both sides of the road, its grass tall enough to hide deer and wild turkeys, but too short to interfere with radio transmissions. No power lines crossed the space. No cell towers pierced the horizon. This was exactly what the manual ordered. Electromagnetic silence broken only by the distant murmur of wind through wheat. I pulled off the road and killed the engine. The rust-colored sedan stopped beside me, not behind, not ahead, but occupying the exact same coordinates my vehicle had just vacated. Through the driver's window, I could see my own silhouette reflected in the phantom car's glass, creating an infinite regression of overlapping images that hurt to contemplate. The tracker's screen went black. In the sudden silence, I heard something that should have been impossible. Another engine idling in perfect unison with my own, though I'd turned mine off moments ago. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a mechanical heartbeat that synchronized with my pulse until I couldn't distinguish between them. I opened the door and stepped onto the grass. The night air carried the scent of approaching rain and something else. Ozone, sharp and electric, like the aftermath of lightning strikes. My footsteps crunched on gravel as I walked toward the front of my car, fishing the calibration tools from my jacket pocket. The antenna needed only minor adjustments to restore proper function. 5 minutes of work would solve everything. But when I looked up from the toolkit, the rust-colored sedan was gone. Relief flooded through me like ice water, washing away the accumulated tension of the past several hours. The phantom vehicle had vanished, taking its impossible presence back to whatever realm had spawned it. The electromagnetic interference was breaking down, allowing reality to reassert its normal boundaries. I began calibrating the antenna with steady hands, adjusting frequencies and signal strength according to the manual's specifications. The tracker's screen flickered back to life, displaying coordinates that made perfect sense. 41.1847 degree non, 95.92 3°. The timestamp showed 9:23 p.m., reasonable given my departure time and the circuitous route I'd taken. Everything was returning to normal. Then I saw my reflection in the car's side mirror, and my blood turned to ice. The face staring back at me wasn't mine. The features were similar, same nose, same jawline, same color eyes, but subtly wrong, as if viewed through imperfect glass. This doppelganger wore my clothes and mimicked my movements with uncanny precision, but something fundamental was missing. Some essential quality that made me who I was had been stripped away, leaving only an approximation. I raised my hand. The reflection raised its hand. I stepped closer to the mirror. The reflection stepped closer to the mirror. But behind the reflected trees and reflected stars, I could see the faint outline of a rust-colored sedan parked in the exact same spot where my car should have been. The tracker's display showed a new timestamp, 9:24 p.m. No minutes had been lost during the calibration, but as I stared at my borrowed face in the mirror, I began to understand that the device hadn't been stealing time at all. It had been recording an exchange. Somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum, my original self still drove down Highway 6 in a rust-colored sedan, watching a phantom in a dark car occupy his coordinates. We'd been switching places with each overlap, trading realities like cards in a cosmic deck. The calibration hadn't fixed the interference. It had completed the transaction. I climbed back into what I now realized was someone else's car and started someone else's engine. The road home stretched ahead, familiar yet foreign, leading toward a life that would fit me like borrowed clothes. The tracker displayed my new coordinates with perfect accuracy, marking my position in a world where I didn't quite belong. In the rearview mirror, the calibration field remained empty except for wind-blown grass and gathering storm clouds. But sometimes, when the headlights hit the glass at just the right angle, I can see another vehicle following behind me. A dark sedan whose driver peers through the windshield with my original eyes, searching for a way back to the reality he lost. The tracker continues to function flawlessly, marking each moment of my displaced existence with digital precision. The timestamp advances at the proper pace, never skipping ahead, never falling behind. But I've learned that time isn't the only thing that can be lost in the spaces between overlapping signals. Sometimes, driving alone through the electromagnetic wilderness of rural highways, I wonder if the calibration was successful after all. Perhaps the antenna is working exactly as designed, maintaining perfect reception in a frequency range where identity itself becomes just another form of data to be transmitted, received, and occasionally misrouted to the wrong destination. The rain has started to fall, drumming against the windshield with borrowed fingers. I adjust the wipers to clear my stolen view of the borrowed road ahead, and somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum, another version of myself makes the same adjustment in reverse. We're both going home, but neither of us will ever arrive. Story 14. The rain started the moment I accepted the ride. Not the gentle kind that whispers against windshields, but the aggressive type that drums against metal and glass like impatient fingers. My phone screen showed the pickup location, a rural road about 20 minutes outside the city limits, where streetlights gave way to gravel and common sense should have told me to decline. But rent was due in 3 days, and I'd learned not to question late-night rides that paid well. The GPS guided me through increasingly narrow roads, past farmhouses with darkened windows and mailboxes that leaned like crooked teeth. My headlights carved weak tunnels through the darkness, illuminating rain that fell in silver sheets. The radio crackled with static between stations, and I'd given up trying to find anything coherent 15 minutes ago. When I reached the coordinates, there was nothing. No passenger waiting under a porch light. No figure hunched against the rain. Just an empty stretch of asphalt that disappeared into blackness ahead and behind. I pulled over and checked my phone, confirming the address twice. The screen showed my location as a blue dot surrounded by green emptiness. No buildings, no landmarks, just the thin line of road cutting through what the map labeled as undeveloped land. I sent a text to the passenger, then tried calling. The phone rang once before cutting to a voicemail that played only dead air. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The rain intensified, each drop hitting my roof like a small stone. I was about to cancel the ride when I noticed something in my rearview mirror. Headlights. 2 pale circles hung in the darkness, perfectly centered in my mirror. They hadn't been there moments before. I was certain of that. The road behind me had been empty, a black throat leading back toward civilization. But now these lights waited, unmoving, like eyes watching from the dark. I flashed my hazards, thinking maybe this was my passenger after all. The lights didn't respond. They simply remained there, fixed and patient. I tried backing up slightly, just to see if the other driver would react. But as I moved, something odd happened. The distance between us remained exactly the same. When I stopped, the lights stopped. When I crept backward another few feet, they moved with me, maintaining that precise gap. My hands felt damp against the steering wheel. I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe the other driver was simply maintaining a safe following distance. But 30 meters seemed oddly specific, and there was something unsettling about how perfectly centered the lights remained in my mirror, never wavering left or right despite the winding road. I decided to move forward and see what happened. The moment I pressed the accelerator, the lights followed. Not immediately, but after a delay that matched exactly how long it would take to maintain that 30-meter gap. When I slowed down, they slowed. When I stopped, they stopped. It was like being connected by an invisible tether, as if my movements were controlling theirs through some mechanical sympathy. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the silence. I should have heard the other engine. Even at that distance, even through the rain and my own motor's hum, there should have been some sound. Instead, there was only the rhythm of my windshield wipers and the steady percussion of rain against glass. I rolled down my window slightly, letting cold air and moisture rush in, straining to catch any noise from behind me. Nothing. The lights followed me through the darkness as silently as ghosts. That's when I first heard the voice. It came through my radio, a whisper threading between static, so faint I almost missed it. At first, I thought it was a distant station bleeding through, but the word was too clear, too deliberate. Conduct. I fumbled with the radio knob, but the static remained constant. The whisper came again, barely audible above the rain. Conduct. My speaker had been damaged for months, crackling and cutting out randomly, but now it seemed to focus this single word with crystalline clarity. I turned the radio off entirely, but the voice continued, emanating from the broken speaker like breath through a wound. Conduct, conduct, conduct. Each repetition sent a chill down my spine. I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb past 40, then 50. The lights behind me accelerated too, maintaining that impossible precision. 60 miles per hour on a dark country road felt reckless, but the need to break free from whatever followed me outweighed caution. The voice grew more insistent. Conduct, conduct, conduct. I took a sharp curve too fast, feeling my tires slip slightly on the wet asphalt. Behind me, the lights navigated the turn with perfect grace, never wavering, never losing that exact distance. It occurred to me that I hadn't seen the vehicle itself, only the lights. The darkness between us seemed absolute, as if the headlights floated disconnected from any physical form. My breathing came faster now, each exhalation fogging the windshield slightly before the defroster cleared it away. The rain had become torrential, transforming the road ahead into a tunnel of silver chaos. My wipers struggled to keep up, creating moments of near blindness between their passes. That's when I decided to test something. I reached for my headlight switch, hesitating for just a moment. What if turning them off sent me careening into a ditch? But the need to understand what followed me overwhelmed my fear of crashing. I flicked the switch. Darkness consumed everything. For an instant I was blind, hurtling through absolute blackness at 60 miles per hour. But that wasn't what made me gasp. The interior of my car suddenly felt wrong. Heavier, colder, saturated with moisture that had no source. Droplets appeared on my dashboard, my steering wheel, the inside of my windshield. They formed and multiplied as if I were underwater, as if the rain had somehow invaded the sealed cabin of my vehicle. I could taste humidity in the air, thick and mineral-heavy like lake water. The droplets on my hands felt real enough, cold and wet against my skin. The voice from my broken speaker became clearer, more urgent. Conduct, conduct, conduct. I switched my headlights back on, and the sensation vanished instantly. The interior was dry again, normal, but my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. In my rearview mirror, the pursuing lights had moved closer. Not quite 30 meters anymore, maybe 25. They pulsed slightly, as if breathing. The road ahead curved sharply to the right, and I could see something that made my stomach drop. The curve led into a section where trees formed a complete canopy overhead, blocking out even the faint starlight. It would be total darkness, exactly what the voice seemed to want me to enter. But off to my left, I spotted something else. A small side road, barely visible, that led to what looked like a maintenance station or rest area. A single floodlight illuminated a small building and a turnaround. The light was weak but steady, creating a pool of pale illumination in the surrounding darkness. The phrase from earlier echoed in my mind: find an illuminated return point, where the reflection of my headlights could engulf the pursuers. I didn't understand where that thought came from. It felt like remembered instructions from a dream I'd never had. I jerked the wheel left, tires squealing as I turned into the side road. My headlights swept across gravel and weeds, then caught the building in their beam. It was abandoned, windows boarded, but the floodlight above cast everything in stark white relief. I pulled into the turnaround and immediately spun my car around to face the main road. The pursuing lights had stopped at the intersection. They hung there, motionless, as if considering their next move. I could see them clearly now in the distance, two pale orbs floating in the darkness where a vehicle should be. There was no shape behind them, no suggestion of metal or glass, just the lights themselves suspended in empty air. Conduct, whispered my radio. I aimed my headlights directly at them and flashed my high beams. The effect was immediate and wrong. Instead of illuminating what followed me, my light seemed to bend around those floating orbs, creating a strange reflection that rippled outward like water. The reflection grew, spreading beyond the lights, engulfing them in an expanding circle of brightness that moved against all logic. The whisper from my radio became a hiss, then static, then silence. The lights behind me flickered once and went out. For several minutes I sat in my car, engine running, high beams pointed at the empty road. The floodlight above hummed softly, and rain continued its relentless percussion against my roof. My hands shook as I reached for my phone to cancel the ride request. But when I looked at the screen, there was no ride to cancel. My app showed no recent trips, no passenger requests, no record of the address that had brought me here. According to my phone, I'd been offline for the past 3 hours. I drove home in silence, taking well-lit highways despite the longer route. The radio remained quiet, my speaker apparently broken again in the normal way. When I finally reached my apartment, I checked my app once more. Still no record of the trip, but my odometer showed 63 additional miles, and my gas tank was noticeably lower. 3 weeks have passed since that night. I've stopped driving for the rideshare company, finding work with a local delivery service instead. Daytime routes only, never rural, never after dark. The rational part of my mind has constructed explanations. Stress, fatigue, maybe a minor breakdown brought on by financial pressure and too many late nights. But sometimes, when it rains, I hear something through my apartment's thin walls. Not quite a voice, not quite static. A whisper that might be wind through old buildings, or might be something else entirely. Conduct. And on those nights, I check my door locks twice before going to bed, wondering if what follows us ever really lets go, or if it simply waits for the next dark road, the next moment when we're far enough from the light to disappear entirely. The radio in my car has been silent ever since, but yesterday I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My odometer has been advancing even when the car is parked in my driveway, adding miles I never drive to destinations I've never been, 30 meters at a time. Story 15. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I wheeled the pallet toward Section K, where the musical plush toys waited in their corrugated prisons. 3:17 a.m., the dead zone of my shift, when the distribution center transformed from a bustling hive of activity into something resembling a mausoleum lined with cardboard tombstones. The forklift's warning beep echoed through empty aisles like a mechanical heartbeat, the only sound besides my own breathing and the persistent electrical buzz overhead. I'd been working nights at Wonderland Distribution for 8 months, long enough to know every squeak in the concrete floors, every shadow cast by the towering shelves, long enough to appreciate the solitude, the way the massive warehouse became mine alone between 2 and 5 a.m. But this past week, something had shifted in the familiar rhythm of my routine, like a discordant note creeping into a well-known melody. The pallet from Section K sat heavy and imposing, wrapped in industrial plastic that caught the harsh light in unpleasant ways. Through the transparent covering, I could make out the colorful boxes stacked in perfect rows. Teddy bears, singing puppies, dancing unicorns. Innocent toys destined for store shelves, meant to bring joy to families across the state. Yet every time I approached this particular shipment, my skin crawled with an inexplicable unease that started in my stomach and spread outward like cold water. I positioned my box cutter and sliced through the plastic wrapping, the material falling away with a whisper that seemed louder than it should have been. The silence that followed felt expectant, as if the warehouse itself was holding its breath. I reached for the first box, a cheerful pink package featuring a smiling elephant with musical notes dancing around its trunk. And the moment my fingers made contact, a sound erupted from somewhere deep within the pallet. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The melody began normally enough, recognizable and sweet, but within seconds it warped into something grotesque. The pitch bent and twisted, the tempo lurched unevenly, and underneath the distorted tune I could swear I heard something else. Syllables that didn't belong, words spoken in reverse, as if the small electronic voice box was trying to communicate something entirely different from its intended song. My hand jerked back instinctively, and the music stopped. The silence that rushed in felt heavier than before, pressing against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. I stared at the box, waiting for some logical explanation to present itself. Faulty wiring, perhaps. Moisture damage from the warehouse's inconsistent climate control. These things happened with electronics. I'd seen it before with other shipments, but as I stood there in the harsh fluorescent glare, I couldn't shake the feeling that the box was staring back at me. I forced myself to continue working, loading box after box onto the conveyor belt that would carry them to the loading dock. Each time I handled another package, I braced myself for another malfunction, another burst of corrupted melody. It happened 3 more times during that first night, always when I wasn't expecting it, always from toys I hadn't touched directly. The sound would erupt from somewhere within the pallet, distorted and wrong, before cutting off abruptly as if someone had yanked a power cord. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., my nerves felt frayed and raw. I told myself it was nothing, just coincidence and faulty merchandise. But as I walked toward the employee exit, I couldn't resist glancing back at Section K. In the pale morning light filtering through the high windows, the remaining pallets cast long shadows that seemed to reach toward me across the polished concrete floor. The second night brought more of the same, only worse. The musical malfunctions occurred more frequently, and each time the backward melodies grew clearer, more deliberate. I began to distinguish actual words buried in the reversed audio, fragmentary phrases that tickled the edge of understanding without quite breaking through into comprehension. Portuguese words, I thought, though spoken in an archaic dialect that sounded like something from centuries past. It was during the third night that I made the decision to record one of these episodes. My phone sat propped against a stack of boxes, recording app activated, red light blinking steadily as I went about my work. I didn't have to wait long. As I lifted a package containing what appeared to be a singing rabbit, a burst of corrupted music filled the air, lasting nearly 30 seconds before cutting off with an electronic squeal that made my teeth ache. Later, in the employee break room with my earbuds firmly in place, I played the recording backward. The transformation was immediate and chilling. Where there had been only gibberish and distorted melody, now clear words emerged from my phone's speaker, spoken in formal Portuguese that seemed to belong to another era entirely. Liberdade, libertação do algodão, primeira vigília, quando o funcionário negar a viagem. Frias, liberation from cotton, first watch, when the employee denies the journey. My hands trembled as I replayed the message, each repetition making the words clearer, more urgent. This wasn't a malfunction. This was communication, deliberate and desperate, as if something trapped within those innocent toys was reaching out, begging for help in the only way it could manage. The fourth night marked the beginning of something far worse than mysterious voices. As I worked my way through the Section K inventory, I began to notice the toys themselves behaving strangely. A teddy bear that I'd just placed on the conveyor belt turned its head to follow my movement as I walked to the next box. A mechanical dog's eyes seemed to track my progress across the warehouse floor. Most disturbing of all, a collection of dolls appeared to orient themselves toward me whenever I wasn't looking directly at them, a phenomenon I only noticed when I'd catch them in my peripheral vision, all facing my direction despite having been positioned randomly in their packages moments before. The rational part of my mind supplied ready explanations. Fatigue, eye strain from the harsh lighting, the natural tendency to anthropomorphize objects when working alone for hours. But each explanation felt increasingly hollow as the behaviors became more pronounced and frequent. By the end of my shift, every toy within a 20-foot radius seemed focused on me with an attention that felt predatory and calculating. It was the security footage that shattered my last attempts at rationalization. During my lunch break, I convinced Gary, the day shift security supervisor, to let me review the overnight surveillance recordings. What I saw on those grainy monitors defied every rational explanation I could construct. The cameras recorded everything in stark black and white, timestamp ticking steadily in the corner as the hours passed in accelerated playback. I watched myself moving through my routine, a small figure dwarfed by the towering shelves and massive machinery. But in the spaces between my passes through each aisle, other movement occurred. Subtle at first, just a slight shift in the arrangement of boxes, a package that seemed to have rotated a few degrees from its original position. But as the night progressed, the movements became more pronounced and coordinated. Toys appeared to be sliding across surfaces when no human was present to observe them. Boxes rearranged themselves into new configurations. Most unnervingly, the plush animals seemed to be gathering near the emergency exit at the far end of the warehouse, forming loose clusters that grew larger and more organized with each passing hour. By dawn, according to the security footage, nearly every toy in Section K had somehow migrated toward the emergency door, creating a soft barricade of colorful boxes and stuffed animals. Yet when I'd left that morning, everything had appeared normal. Products properly arranged on their shelves, inventory organized according to standard protocol. Weird shadows, Gary muttered, squinting at the monitors. Compression artifacts, maybe. These old cameras don't handle low light very well. But I knew what I was seeing wasn't a technical malfunction. Something was happening in that warehouse during the dark hours of my shift. Something that existed in the spaces between human observation, in the blind spots of perception and recording equipment. The fifth night, I came prepared. In addition to my phone for recording, I brought a small digital camera and positioned it to capture the Section K area from multiple angles. I also carried a portable scale, intending to document the weight discrepancies I'd begun noticing whenever I tried to move completed shipments to the loading dock. The musical messages continued, growing more frequent and urgent. My recordings now contained extended communications in that archaic Portuguese, pleas that spoke of imprisonment, of consciousness trapped within cotton and synthetic fur, of a desperate need to escape before some undefined deadline. The toys' behavior became increasingly bold. No longer content to simply orient themselves toward me, they now moved openly in my peripheral vision, Small shifts and adjustments that stopped the moment I turned to look directly at them. But it was the weight anomaly that truly unnerved me. Every box I placed on the portable scale registered significantly heavier than its stated shipping weight. A package labeled as containing a 2-pound stuffed animal would tip the scale at 4 or 5 pounds. Boxes that should have contained light, hollow toys felt solid and dense, as if they'd been filled with sand or concrete instead of cotton batting and electronic components. When I tried to load a completed pallet onto the truck dock's hydraulic lift, the mechanism groaned and strained against weight that should have been well within its operational parameters. The lift's digital display showed numbers that made no sense, readings that suggested the innocent toys somehow weighed twice their stated mass, as if something additional occupied the space within each package. More disturbing still was what happened when I attempted to secure the emergency exit. Following some instinct I couldn't quite name, I'd brought zip ties and planned to loop them through the door's panic bar, creating a temporary deterrent against whatever force seemed drawn to that particular location. But when I approached the exit, I discovered that someone, or something, had already been at work. Thin strands of thread stretched across the doorway in an intricate web, each strand connected to others in a pattern too complex and deliberate to be accidental. The thread appeared to be cotton, similar to what might be found inside stuffed animals, but it had been woven together with a precision that spoke of intelligence and purpose. The barrier was incomplete, as if whoever was creating it had been interrupted in their work. But the intent was clear. Something wanted to prevent exit through that door. As I stood staring at this cotton barricade, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from my supervisor. K-section shipment must go out tonight. Truck leaves at 5 a.m. sharp. No delays. I checked my watch. 3:42 a.m. Less than an hour and 20 minutes to identify which toy contained the source of these disturbances and separate it from the rest of the shipment. The voices from my recordings had been specific about timing, something about the first watch, and an employee who would deny the journey. I was beginning to understand that I was the employee in question, and that my decision about tonight's shipment would determine more than just inventory management. The search began in earnest then, a methodical examination of every remaining box in Section K. I opened package after package, looking for anything that might distinguish one toy from the others. Unusual weight, strange markings, manufacturing irregularities. But each stuffed animal appeared identical to its companions. Soft cotton batting, synthetic fur, simple electronic voice boxes powered by AA batteries. It was while examining a package of what appeared to be ordinary teddy bears that I noticed something peculiar about one particular specimen. Unlike its companions, this bear's eyes seemed to follow my movements with uncomfortable directness. When I removed it from its packaging, the toy felt slightly heavier than it should have, and its fur had an unusual texture, rougher and more coarse than the synthetic materials typically used in modern plush manufacturing. More telling was what happened when I placed the bear on my workstation and stepped back. Every other toy within sight immediately oriented itself toward this particular stuffed animal, as if acknowledging its authority or responding to some signal I couldn't perceive. The bear itself remained motionless, but there was something in its glassy black eyes that suggested awareness, intelligence, waiting. I picked up the toy and carried it to an isolated corner of the warehouse, far from the other inventory. The moment I set it down, the strange behaviors throughout Section K ceased entirely. The oppressive feeling of being watched lifted. The subtle movements in my peripheral vision stopped. It was as if someone had turned off a switch, restoring the warehouse to its normal, benign state. But as I stood there in the sudden quiet, studying the innocent-looking teddy bear that seemed to command such influence over its cotton and polyester brethren, I realized that removing it from the shipment wouldn't solve anything. This wasn't just about one defective toy or a simple quality control issue. The bear was simply a focal point, a conduit for something larger and more complex than I could fully understand. The voices in my recordings had spoken of liberation, of escape from cotton prisons, of consciousness trapped in artificial forms. They'd mentioned a journey that someone would deny, a first watch that would end with freedom or continued imprisonment. And now, holding what appeared to be the source of all these disturbances, I understood that the choice was mine to make. I could include the bear in tonight's shipment, sending it out into the world along with its companions, or I could keep it here, isolated in the warehouse, preventing whatever journey the voices had spoken of, but also denying whatever liberation they sought. Either choice carried consequences I couldn't fully foresee. As I stood there in the fluorescent-lit silence, weighing my options, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bear's mouth, which had been stitched closed with typical manufacturer precision, was beginning to come undone. Thread by thread, the seam was unraveling as I watched, revealing what lay beneath the synthetic fur and cotton batting. Inside, instead of simple stuffing and electronic components, I glimpsed something that looked disturbingly organic. Tissues that pulsed with their own rhythm, structures that resembled neural networks more than toy manufacturing materials. And as the bear's mouth opened wider, I heard something that wasn't coming from any electronic voice box. My own voice, speaking words I'd never said, in that same archaic Portuguese I'd been recording all week. A viagem deve começar agora, ou nunca terminará. The journey must begin now, or it will never end. I dropped the bear and backed away, but my legs felt disconnected from my body, responding to commands I wasn't giving. Around me, the warehouse began to shift and change, the familiar aisles stretching into impossible distances, the fluorescent lights flickering in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The smell of cotton filled the air, thick and cloying, as if the warehouse itself was transforming into the interior of some vast stuffed animal. My phone showed 4:47 a.m. The truck would arrive soon, and I would have to make my choice. But as I stood there in the changing warehouse, surrounded by toys that watched me with increasing intensity, I began to wonder if the choice had ever really been mine to make. Perhaps I'd been just another component in this strange mechanism all along, another toy being positioned for whatever journey awaited us all. The bear lay on the floor where I'd dropped it, mouth hanging open, revealing the impossible anatomy within. And in that dark cavity, I could swear I saw my own reflection staring back, not as I was now, but as something soft and cotton-filled, with glassy eyes and a stitched smile that would never change. Outside, I could hear the rumble of the delivery truck approaching the loading dock, right on schedule.